Are people, human beings, more clever today than they were 100,000 years ago?
Of course, we have virtually no evidence about that. But going from first principles and from my feeling of what the situation has been, definitely not. Where they were definitely our equals in mental capacity and in anything physiological to do with thought or understanding. They were our equals. The difference between us and them is culture and technology. So those are beyond comparison different today, but they have only been beyond comparison different for a few hundred years, like since the Enlightenment. Before that, people were much like they had been in prehistoric times.
Well, this is the interesting thing. A lot of people will look to our ancestors and implicitly assume that they must have been pretty stupid. I mean, these fools running around just about working out how to use fire, didn't invent the wheel for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. They must have been pretty stupid. The question is, if our brain structures are essentially the same, evolution works on an unfathomably sort of long stretch of time. We haven't had enough time for our brains to significantly evolve since, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago.
Quite so, probably more. Yeah.
Why then, in the last few hundred years in particular, but I suppose in the last few thousand years, really, if we're talking about society, have we managed to go from these helpless apes wandering around in about the middle of the food chain to just dominating the planet to the extent that I can know with a relative level of certainty about the chemical makeup of the interior of stars in galaxies that I can't even see with the naked eye? How did that happen if not an increase in intelligence?
As I said, it's culture and technology, but there's another thing to take into account, which is that our ability to do this thing that we do, which I call explanatory creativity, the ability to create new explanations of the world and of other things, that evolved, and it's fairly obvious just from the few data points that we've just discussed that it can't possibly have evolved for what we now want to use it for. It can't possibly have evolved for creating new explanations, because so few new explanations were in fact discovered 100,000 years ago. At that time, well, first of all, we know that they were capable of inventing radio telescopes and advanced theories, because inventing campfires involves exactly the same logic and epistemology go. That's the same feat. And incidentally, learning human language, the subtleties of human language, is also a similar size feat. And we all do that with just the attributes of early childhood. So it can't have evolved for the thing that we use it for now. That is the ability to the ability for the faculty for creative explanation can't possibly have evolved for creative explanation. Otherwise, it would have done what it's done recently. It would have caused exponential improvement. And in fact, improvement in prehistoric times and right up to historic times has been so slow that a typical person did not experience any. And never mind effect any. So that means if a faculty isn't used then it can't have exerted evolutionary pressure.
Yes, so it
But
can't be the reason why it came about, but we've clearly got this faculty for, as you call
yes,
it, creative explanation. And to be clear, when you talk about creative explanation, maybe we should spell that out for people who are unfamiliar, but we're kind of talking about the thing that occurs around about the time of the Enlightenment, which is tied up with the scientific method, the idea of looking at phenomena in the universe and trying to come up with an explanation for why it's the case
yes,
through things like science. And the faculty to do this doesn't just spring into existence. It must have been there in our brains 100,000 years ago, but because no one was doing it back then, that can't be what it evolved for.
exactly. So very few people were, few and rarely. So somebody had the idea to put the flaming branch on the ground and put other branches on top of it to drive off the predators. But that sort of new idea was very rare. And so that's why it didn't exert any evolutionary pressure.
So the question that's raised, of course, naturally is why does this faculty evolve in the first place?
I think there's only one reasonable answer to this, and that is that it evolved to learn culture. So somebody invented campfires, or each noticeable improvement in campfires was invented by someone, but it wouldn't have been any use in history if that someone had been unable to transmit it to other people. And in fact, it seems that it wasn't just campfires; it was a whole load of things, knowing which foods are poisonous and how to get nutrition out of foods that are hard to get at, which other species don't have. They don't have this general purpose facility to do that. It must have been extremely useful, but it depended much more on transmitting knowledge, or I should say receiving knowledge from one's culture, than on creating knowledge in the first place. Knowledge was created in the first place extremely rarely, but it was passed on all the time. So people will have grown up in a culture where their lives, their livelihood, their well-being depended on assimilating this cultural knowledge, but they had no writing. They had initially they had only very crude language. By the way, there's I don't know what to call him, a paleontologist or a language expert called Daniel Everett, who thinks that language evolved long, long before speech did. And so he thinks even 2 million years ago there was language, but it was because language was so important that speech gradually evolved.
That's fascinating. Okay, so language of some other kind exists
Yes.
beforehand, something analogous to like sign language or
Yes,
communication
anything
of some
symbolic.
kind.
So some action or behavior that can be taken as symbolic of something else.
That's fascinating because I think the general picture or assumption is that the evolution of speech and language starts almost in the Wittgensteinian sense of someone sort of pointing at a slab and
Yes.
going, slab, and that evolves into language. But the
Yes.
idea that language kind of already existed and just needed a vocalization to map onto is a
Yes.
really interesting thought. And it does also raise the question, could it have been that we normalized in our evolutionary history on a different trajectory, communicating through some other means? Communicating
Could
just
easily have
with
been. Yes.
our hands, like sign language is the norm or something like that.
Yes.
I suppose vocals are probably the best way of doing it. I can't imagine a more efficient way of getting information across, but that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. So we've got now this potential explanation for why, as you put it, creative explanations evolve in the human psyche, but they lay dormant because what they evolved for was passing on knowledge from society to society, how to start a campfire, this kind of stuff. Then something happened, and I don't know if you date it to the Enlightenment or if you think that when societies started to emerge much earlier than that, something also kind of went on.
No,
But
no,
at
not that
some
long
point,
ago.
something changes, right?
Yeah, it's the scientific revolution. Perhaps that was the first of the revolutions, and there was the Enlightenment. The process of switching to this new kind of thinking has not finished. There are many aspects of our culture that are still of the old type.
Yeah, and I suppose people might want to say, but surely something changed when we went from being hunter-gatherers to, agriculturalists, the agricultural revolution, the development of society. But presumably these kind of things happened on a much grander timescale than the revolutionary shift that happens
Yes,
with something like the Enlightenment.
I don't think those things changed us cognitively. It's hard to find the right word, because cognitively can apply to things in the brain and also things in culture. So I think what has changed since 100,000 years ago, or whatever it is only culture. The changes in brain and anatomy are relatively trivial by comparison.
Sure.
And I don't think that the advent of civilization, like 4 or 5,000 years ago, changed anything. It changed it only quantitatively. That is, um, after we had people living together and working together the whole time, and trade and that kind of thing, then we needed more sophisticated language, we needed more sophisticated concepts and more sophisticated culture, which led to writing and so on. But I think the real change, the important change, is the change where improvements in culture happen on a timescale that's noticeable to humans. Before that, it was really just dumb evolution. People may have contributed to it creatively, but then individuals have been creative right back to 2 million years ago, or whatever it was. But
Mm.
people who notice change in society and then contribute to change in society, that is only a few hundred years old. And these landmarks, like the scientific revolution, Galileo, and then the Renaissance, and so on, those things are quite recent. Though I do speculate in The Beginning of Infinity that it might have happened many times before, and so that cultures were, as it were, trying to switch to this new mode, but were destroyed for one reason or another. They failed to find a way of being stable under change. That seems to be the really new thing about our enlightenment. That we can have noticeable change all the time. We can complain about it all the time. We can fight against it and so on, but the society retains its coherence. No
Mm.
guarantee this will continue, but
Yeah. So
we can hope.
for most of human history, if you asked somebody, what do you think life looks like in 100 years from now? Like, if you had to draw a picture, they would draw a picture of the world today. If you asked somebody, 1,000 years ago, draw something 100 years from now, they would maybe say, well, I hope that my son has, become a master in my trade, or something like this. But there would be no new technology. Maybe if you said, what about 1,000 years from now, they might imagine that cities are bigger and stuff like this. But today, if you ask somebody to predict what life might be like in 10 years, they'll be talking about flying cars or invisibility cloaks or nuclear war or whatever it is.
Yes.
These unfathomable changes that happen in the blink of an eye. Now, that to me is the difference. You spell this out quite illustratively, I think, and helpfully in pointing out that if you look at architectural movements, experts in architecture can look at a building from hundreds of years ago and say it looks like it's 14th century. They can
Yes.
sort of date it plus or minus 100 years based on the shape of its windows or whatever. Today, you can look at an iPhone and date to within the year
Yes.
because the changes are happening so quickly. You can, like, I don't know if that's a fair comparison, because architecture even today probably doesn't move quite so quickly, but it's clear that things are speeding up. Now, to me, before considering what you have to say on this kind of stuff, I look at that and I think, this is just the nature of exponential growth. It's a bit like how the human species is growing in number, and for thousands of years, there weren't that many people, in the thousands, millions. And then, because of the nature of exponential growth, right now it seems like by the time I die, there might be 9, 10, 11 billion people on the planet. And that's a crazy growth, but that's nothing special. That's just because things grow exponentially. And so we just happen to be at the fastest bit of the exponential growth in technology so far. Like, isn't it just that? Why do we have to posit that something significantly changed?
I don't think so. That certainly is a factor, that the more people there are, the more thinking happens, and that's a good
Yeah.
thing. And I think that may well have contributed, especially recently. But um, I don't think it explains the technological takeoff at all, in both directions. First of all, if you think back to antiquity, where there might have been, I speculate in the book that what Athens had before it lost the Peloponnesian War was a kind of nascent enlightenment, and it failed. Um, and uh, Athens was like 10,000 citizens. I mean, it may have had 30, 50,000 inhabitants, but the people who were contributing to the culture that we now call Athenian culture were maybe 10,000 people. And even at the time, there were, what, I don't know, a billion people in the world. So the number of people was a factor, but it wasn't a significant factor. It wasn't a factor that increased the creative population of Athens by that much. I mean, it did a bit, because Athens became great because it was trading nation, and so on. There were those factors, but the main thing is that it had a culture of what we would call human rights and democracy and pursuit of truth, and freedom, and so on. And Pericles says in his funeral oration, he points to things that would have been very alien to every other culture at the time. He points to saying things, well, our educational system is so much more lenient than everyone else's. Good heavens, everyone else would have said our educational system is so much more harsh, and called that a good thing. And
Mm,
and he says we don't care what people do in their own homes. Again, other cultures were conformist. So it's not that
yeah.
it was a perfect culture. Cultures that change are by definition not perfect. they they start off worse than they become. And now, if you go over to the present day, the iPhone and so on, those changes are again being brought about by a small minority of people. It's certainly more than 10,000 like in Athens, but it's nowhere near the billions. For a start, it's really only happening in the West. And then within the West, it's mostly happening in the Anglosphere. And within and so on. I could go on and offend more and more people, but it I don't think the current exponential growth in technology is being population driven.
Well, I don't mean to
It's
suggest just that it's because of the population getting bigger. I mean that in the same way that populations naturally can exponentially increase, sort of as an analogy, not as a causal explanation, technology does the same thing. Somebody inventing an iPhone doesn't have to work from scratch. They've got computers, they've got computer chips, they've got screen technology, and all they kind of have to do is put it together. That's still quite a big task, but the more that happens, the easier those kinds of inventions and developments become. And so it makes sense that at some point it gets off the ground and then boom, exponential growth, not because of some shift in mindset, but just because we've got more technology to build upon now.
Yes, but just because something could happen doesn't mean usually that it does happen. And so again, when somebody invented that first campfire I was talking about, you could say, well, it won't be long before somebody drops some food on it and finds that once it's been on the fire for a while, it tastes better. And yet that didn't happen for 10,000, 20,000 years.
Interesting, because it takes a kind of mindset of like,
Yes.
we want to go and find out stuff. We want to go
Yes.
and figure out, how can we produce better food? Why is this healthy?
Yes.
Why is this unhealthy? That kind of stuff. And that's the attitude that is embodied in the Enlightenment.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
we've mentioned the Enlightenment, and I know that you're not a fan of defining terms. Neither am I in many respects. But it's people generally have an idea of the Enlightenment as being something kind of to do with the scientific revolution, something kind of to do with like some political movements that happen. Roughly speaking, when are we dating the Enlightenment to? What kind of thing are we talking about in like a family resemblance style definition?
I think you just defined it quite well when you said it was the idea that we can improve things, that we can go out into the world and find out how to make things better, that sort of thing. It
And
didn't
when does this come
happen.
about?
Yeah, well, Galileo had it, but probably most people in his day did not have it. So most people in his day were not thinking about the world in the way that he was. In fact, they were stigmatizing the way he thought about the world. He had trouble with the Inquisition, and
Yes.
Bronowski said that, and I don't know whether this is historically accurate or not, but I trust Bronowski. He said that Bronowski's experience put a complete stop to scientific progress in the Mediterranean region, and it was only because progress moved to Northern Europe that what we call the Enlightenment continued.
Sorry,
If
you
that
mean
hadn't happened.
what happened to Galileo put people off?
Yes, specifically
Yeah.
to Galileo.
Yeah. So Galileo's treatment by the Inquisition was sort of the thing that puts a stop to progress for a time because people see that this is what will happen.
Yes, so I mean, one can argue, no doubt, about what the historical forces were and so on, but it was either that, or it was that kind of thing, or it was that tendency. There certainly wasn't the other tendency in society, where
Mm.
when it then took shape more in especially the Netherlands, and then in England and Scotland, that it became like more recognizably what you described.
Mm. So when kind of does that begin happening, and at what point do we consider it like? I'm talking on the scale of like decades here or whatever you like. When does it start to, let's say, get off the ground? And also, like, why? Like, is there something that happens that suddenly snaps people out of this thousands year long slumber
It
into
seems
the Enlightenment
it
age?
seems to have happened because of accidental reasons. Like when it happened in Florence, it was because previously there had been a fragmentation of polities and a growth of trade, and so you got these super rich people, and the super rich people somehow got the idea that they made better buildings in antiquity. How come we can't do that now? So they hired people like Michelangelo and Leonardo, and said, can you do this? And they first did it, and then they realized they could do it better. And once they realized they could do it better, the Renaissance took off. And
Mm.
then in Northern Europe, there were, again, it was accidental circumstances, like the Netherlands were a tiny country fighting the most powerful superpower, namely the Spanish and then the French. And how they survived is a miracle, and this miracle was caused by thinking about how to survive. And
Yes.
and they had a society that had Protestants and Catholics and Jews and free thinkers, and they had to find a political setup where all those people could contribute positively rather than fighting against each other. And so they, I saw on a documentary once that in the reign of the documentary was about Queen Elizabeth I, but one of the scenes was an ambassador from the Netherlands came and had some negotiation with Queen Elizabeth I, and he was the first commoner ever to have engaged in a negotiation with someone royal in Britain, or maybe in Europe, I don't know. So, and then in 1688, the Glorious Revolution, that culture, that political culture, but also to some extent the other things, philosophical and so on, but there it was mostly the political culture, got shifted bodily to England because England, and then a few decades later also Scotland, needed a rationale that didn't risk the destructive effects of monarchy. So
yes. What is the Glorious Revolution for our
1688?
But what happened? Can you give us a...
So they kicked out the previous king, or they claimed that he abdicated, but in fact they kicked him out because he was conspiring with the Catholic superpowers. I think in his day that was Louis XIV or someone. I'm not sure, but anyway, it sounds very anachronistic to say, oh, it was the Catholic danger, but the Catholic danger was like the jihadi danger today, or rather, if there was a superpower in the world, if the major superpower in the world were jihadists, then somebody having a jihadist ideology was an existential danger to any kind of progressive society that was trying to form. So then they invited in the not the king, but they invited in as king a Netherlands noble, William, who then became the King William, and they allowed him to be king on condition that he promised not to do a certain number of things which the previous king had done, to try to restrict the privileges of Parliament and individual rights and so on. And that thing that they presented him with to sign was the English Bill of Rights, which was then copied 100 years later by the Americans to make the American Bill of Rights a somewhat improved version. But it started off, and it started off in England, and that was where the concept of constitutional monarchy began. So he was the king, but, for example, the succession could be determined by Parliament, if they so chose.
And you're beginning to see the creeping in of, for want of a better word, rationalistic approaches to things like government that had traditionally been the prerogative of these slightly mystical, authoritative, quasi-divine institutions. And the main thing that I think characterizes the Enlightenment, for most people at least, is rejection of authority, or at least the legitimacy of questioning authority. So in the scientific world, it's Galileo against the Catholic Church. In the artistic world, it's new forms of painting or new forms of sculpture against the traditional way of doing things. Although I think that's a bit less, a bit less radical, but still there. In political thought, it's more design, more like upfront design in government, rather than traditions that have evolved over time and authorities that are essentially based on those traditions. And this is what the Enlightenment starts to bring about. And interestingly, as you said a moment ago, a lot of this kind of happens by accident, but that's not a surprise because that's how evolution works. Like on a biological level, it's accidental by which I mean essentially random mutations, that when they happen to hit on something good for whatever reason, evolution just catches onto that and it begins to spread. And similar things happen in the world of ideas. So I was thinking about writing. Like, where does writing come from? Well, most people think, most experts, as far as I know, believe that it sort of evolves in Mesopotamia and that its first instances are probably economic. They probably invented ways of writing in order to keep their accounts, in order to make sure that the money was going into the right places. And so nobody is inventing writing with a view towards one day, increasing biblical literacy during the Protestant Revolution. But obviously writing has had this revolutionary effect on our ability to communicate with each other and share ideas and stuff. And the people who hit upon it for a completely different reason, but because it just so happened to be so good at doing this other thing, it stuck around. And it sounds like maybe the Enlightenment sort of gets going for a similar accidental reason.
I think it did. But with hindsight, we can usually see that it wasn't an accident that this discovery could lead to something better. Not that it would. It need not have. And I think in most cases it didn't. But there was a reason why inventing writing later caused the Protestant Reformation. And there was and a reason why the Protestant Reformation, which at the time you might think it was an anti-Enlightenment motion, because it's what we would today call fundamentalist religion. But it had in it this rejection of authority. And that was more important than any of its actual doctrines, because that rejection of authority led to other rejections of authority. And with hindsight, we can see that. At the time, we probably couldn't have.
Yes, and that's one of the big sort of Catholic qualms with Protestants is not, and I mean at the time, as well as I suppose now in a historical, with a historical lens on, it's not just the theological disputes, although there is that. There is also this underlying current of, like, if you're able to just waltz in and say that these books aren't canonical, then how on earth do you know that the books you have in the Bible right now are canonical?
Yes.
And that question, you either like ask that question and go, yeah, you're right, we shouldn't question that, you're right. Or you go, yeah, you're right, we should question that. Let's find out why these books are canonical. And the Enlightenment spirit is the latter of those. And of course, it's accidental that people stumble upon, writing as an effective means for communication. But it's no mystery why, once that accident has been stumbled upon, it then will of course lead to all of these kinds of wonderful benefits, similar to like the invention of electricity or something. I think when Benjamin Franklin is going around with his key and kite and thinking this is kind of cool, he probably had some idea that the energy could be harnessed or something, but there's no way that he has in mind, one day I'll be able to FaceTime my grandmother from halfway across the globe. But it is easy to see how that naturally, comes about because of that. But it means that the shift in mindset of the Enlightenment, I guess we're painting it here not so much as a bunch of people getting fed up with living in an authoritarian state and going, we're going to champion reason and change the world. It's a slightly more historically accidental movement that just happens to hit upon something good.
Yes, usually people wanted to solve specific problems, not change the environment for solving problems in general. Usually, I mean, sometimes they had grandiose ideas, but yeah.
It's only recently that we start thinking in those terms. Like these days, we're constantly talking about technologies that will improve the world for our children,
right?
Because we've developed a mindset where that kind of thing is possible. Whereas it's hard to emphasize to people now that if you were living in the Middle Ages, there is no like, let's create a better world for our children. It's the same world. Like nothing changes. There's nothing new under the sun,
Which is a quotation from someone making that very point in the Bible.
Yes. From Ecclesiastes, that nothing ever changes. If only the author of Ecclesiastes had access to the iPhone.
Most of the time, certainly before the Enlightenment, but I think even since, people had in their hands the means of creating something universal, and they didn't. They failed. So writing was invented, And then alphabetic writing was invented, which made writing many times more efficient and didn't require professional scribes and so on. And it didn't spread. And similarly, numbers were invented. The placeholder system was invented with the zero and so on, and that didn't spread. And when it did spread, from Mesopotamia to India, and then to the Muslim world, and only then to Europe, like basically after the Renaissance. And then it was resisted.
Mm.
And the argument that, look, this is much more efficient and easy and so on, that didn't speak to people because, as you just said, they didn't have a conception of the world improving, especially improving by a small change whose consequences you can't predict in advance. That again was
Yes.
not, just, oh, it's better, wasn't an argument. We've always done
Yeah.
it this way.
And
So
it sounds
yes,
kind of it sounds a little bit to us now when we hear of an old society or a king sort of going, no, we can't allow this. It sounds like to us we're like, gosh, he's suppressing progress, but you've got to remember the mindset, right? Like today we have this idea that the world will change radically within the next 100 years, and so our decision
yes,
is like, how is it going to change? And we better be engaged in figuring out of all the possible options, which one we want.
yeah,
In those days, it wasn't like, well, the world's going to change in 100 years, let's look for which solution is best. It was like, the world isn't going to change. And here's someone coming along, not presenting the best option, but just something new. They're like injecting themselves into a society that is thought of as stable. And it's totally understandable to me why a ruler would look at that and go, whoa, like, no thanks. We've been doing this for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and it works. We can't have this radical interference. It's only today with our mindset that change is inevitable that we're so much more comfortable with exploring these ideas, I think.
yes. So this ancient king you're thinking of would have said, look, I've got enough troubles as it is
Mm,
without introducing something new and unpredictable.
yes.
I've got
And
enough troubles of the old type.
yeah, and
Um,
there is something that comes along as well with the scientific revolution and afterwards, that people kind of start to care about truth for its own sake. And I don't mean
yes,
truth of the kind where Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, but truths of the kind of like metaphysical truths, like, what is an atom? What is it made of? Like, why are the planets in orbit outside of divine prerogative? The thing that strikes me is that, well, as you write about, it's not like our apish ancestors weren't looking at the stars at night and also wondering, what are those things? What are they made of? Why are they there? Why aren't they falling down to the earth?
mhm.
So, like, what is it that has allowed us to start answering those questions more sufficiently? You've said that one of the defining characteristics of the Enlightenment, maybe the defining characteristic
Yes.
of the Enlightenment, is not so much rejection of authority or science, whatever that is, but specifically seeking good explanations. Like, what does that mean? And why is that
I
the
think that
Enlightenment spirit?
encompasses the other kinds of thing, like rejecting authority and so on, because a good explanation is, you can't tell if an explanation is good until you criticize it, until you find out whether it solves the problem it's intended to solve. Without, you can't find a good explanation without criticizing it with a view to changing it if it turns out not to meet the criteria that you want. And so I define a good explanation as one that, as an idea which is hard to change without losing the property that it explains what it purports to explain, what it accounts for, what it purports to account for, if we want to put it in a non-circular way.
Sure,
Um,
like how well, the explanation of why the planets are in orbit is because the angels are holding them up. That's an explanation, but it's a bad
yes,
explanation because you could just change that explanation without really affecting what it essentially predicts. You could be
yes,
like, there could be maybe the angels are pulling instead of pushing, or if we
Yes.
then discover that the planets are actually like they sometimes crash into each other in other solar systems, we say, well, sometimes the angels go for lunch, or we could just literally come up with some explanation as we go along. It
Yes.
needs to be something that is, well, it sounds to me like a good explanation therefore needs to be falsifiable, but I don't think that's quite the right word.
No, because falsifiable, where it applies, it only applies in science. So this doesn't tell you what makes a philosophical explanation, for example, good or bad. And even in science, it really only addresses the predictive part of a theory. And so, like we were talking about last time, if somebody has a theory that's philosophically nonsense, and it makes the same predictions, then it can't be distinguished from another theory that's a better explanation. But what will happen is that if somebody or if the scientific culture becomes committed to the bad explanation, then it will prevent further progress, because further progress is always at the level of the explanation. Somebody thinks of a new thing that could be happening, a new unseen thing that could account for the seen things. The explanation in science is always accounting for the seen in terms of the unseen.
Yes, and this
And
happens in science. Like people, like the idea of authority. You're kind of imagining the scientist versus the Catholic Church. But I mean, famously, Einstein's greatest blunder, as he described it himself, his greatest blunder was that his calculations, his equations of relativity, and I'm not a scientist, so forgive me for butchering this, but they essentially predicted a finite universe or an expanding universe. And
an expanding one, yes.
Einstein's like, well, the universe can't be expanding because the universe is infinite. And so he adds in this constant, the so-called cosmological constant, into his equation in order to square his theory of relativity with the infinite universe. And then
It's not actually the infinite part that was the problem.
the expanding
It's
part.
the expanding and contracting.
Sure. Okay.
He
So
wanted the universe to
be static.
yes,
Yes. So
yes,
Einstein thinks the universe has to be static for various reasons. It doesn't make any sense for the universe to be constantly expanding or whatever. Has to be
yes,
static. And since his calculations said that the universe is expanding, he's like, oh, well, we need to rectify this problem. So he adds in the cosmological constant
yes,
to make the universe static again. And then as it begins to emerge experimentally that the universe is in fact expanding, he removes this cosmological constant and calls it his greatest blunder, because he did not add in that constant because he needed to explain some experimental data, or because it logically didn't make sense without it, but because he had an assumption about the way the universe worked and just had to make his theory fit that assumption.
yes.
And Einstein did that, you know, this isn't some fool. This is Einstein.
Yes, yes, and curiously, one of the main people that made progress in this area was not only a mathematician but a Catholic priest at the same time. So some things had changed even there.
Yeah, Georges Lemaitre, I think his name.
Yeah, Lemaitre.
If I'm
Yes,
thinking of the right guy, yeah. And
that's right.
is he the man who? No, he didn't coin the term Big Bang, but he was one of the first people to sort of be talking about it as a
Yes,
scientific theory.
yes.
Was it Fred Hoyle
Fred
who
Hoyle
coined?
coined the term disparagingly.
Yeah, like on a radio show, he was like, "Oh, this silly Big Bang
Yeah,
theory," and
yeah,
fast forward a few hundred years, and that will be what
yeah.
he's mostly remembered for.
And an even bigger picture, which includes things other than science. It includes philosophy and mathematics and interpersonal relationships and every other application of knowledge to the human condition. Um, um, was it existed from the beginning until now. That is there's a conflict between, as I said at the beginning, the faculty of creative explanation evolved not for making creative explanations, but for preserving existing knowledge, preserving existing culture. And ever since then, there has been an inherent conflict in the human condition, both individually and in society, between the need to preserve existing knowledge and the need to create new knowledge. And for most of human history, preserving existing knowledge trumped any kind of attempt to improve knowledge, because attempts to improve knowledge risk error, or rather, to be exact, it risks error that has never occurred before. There were plenty of errors that had occurred before. Like I said, plenty of kings got overthrown because they couldn't solve the problem of how to fend off the enemy. But they were in familiar territory conceptually, and they were afraid of changing culture. And this fear of changing culture was built into culture. This conflict exists to this day. We have the most extreme example known to me in the West, anyway, is the conflict in education between preserving existing knowledge and creating new knowledge. So even today, education theory is conceived as the theory of how to decant existing knowledge from the brains that already know it to the brains that do not yet know it.
Yes.
And Popper calls that the bucket theory of the mind, that the mind is a bucket and knowledge is a fluid. And what he stressed, and what I always also want to stress, is that not only is that a mischaracterization of knowledge and of the use of knowledge, but it is the wrong way around as a practical matter. Even right back 2 million years ago, the transmission of cultural knowledge was not something done by the transmitter. It was something done by the receiver. The transmitter did things like light a fire and hit the younger person when he didn't put things on, didn't put the branches on straight. You can't transmit knowledge that way. The knowledge there just isn't enough bandwidth to transmit the actual knowledge. The receiver has to guess what each particular action is for. And even if once language had evolved, even if the transmitter of the knowledge actually tells him what it's for, you have to leave gaps so that the air can get in. That's not going to mean anything to the receiver unless the receiver can guess the picture that is in the other person's mind, the picture of the flame being nourished by air coming in and the air being able to rush in through the holes and so on. If you try to explain something without a purpose to somebody, you'll see that they don't get in mind the same picture you do. It's only when they've understood what you're trying to say, then they can be accurate. And even then, even with modern language and culture so tightly knit, again, I put this example into the book. If you tell somebody directions, like first left, second right, they want to find the nearest garage and say first left, second right, then turn right again at the church or something. Usually that won't work. Usually there's enough leeway in the concept of first left and second right and at the church to mean that there's too much chance of them getting lost until they understand what you're saying, that you're trying to tell them how to avoid the part of town that has the side streets and you want to get onto the part of town that has the main road. Once they've understood that you're trying to tell them that, then they can understand the first left, second right bit.
Yeah, so we're now talking about, to be clear, the way that people learn things and the way that education works. And there is this idea, as Popper calls it, the bucket theory of the mind, where the transmitter just says stuff. I say, Professor Deutsch, here is how you make a fire. And you go, thanks, Alex, and you've learned something.
Right.
Whereas the idea that Popper has and that you have is that's not how it works. Instead, you have to take a guess yourself. You have to just conjure up a guess as to how something works, and then sort of, I guess, like test it against reality.
Exactly,
and, like,
test it,
see if
criticize
it
it.
works. Yeah. And the immediate thought I had with like the fire thing is that now that we have language, if I explain to you how a fire works, now, of course, you'll already have had to sort of have learnt language and know what wood is and stuff. But suppose that's the world we're in now. Like, you and me. Imagine that I just didn't know how to make a fire, which, to be honest, if you stuck me in a forest with no, like, anything, maybe I wouldn't know how to start a fire, to be honest. Something to
Nor
do with
would I.
flint. Or there's like you put a bit of string on a stick and then you sort of rub it back and forward. Something like that, right? So I don't know. So someone's going to come along and they're going to say, well, actually, Alex, what you need to do is take some tinder and put it on the floor and then get a bit of flint and this kind of thing, and they sort of show me how to do it. The feeling I get is that they have just told me something. I've learned because I'm a big bucket. They've taken that information. They've put it into my mind. Where am I going wrong there?
The wrong theory of epistemology is quite intuitive. It's there's lots of facts about knowledge that are not intuitive because most of what is happening unconsciously. What's happening in your mind is happening unconsciously. If you think, especially if you think that it must be the case, after all, first he knew it and I didn't, and then at the end I knew it and he still knew it. So something has been transferred. But
Yeah.
something has been transferred, but not by the mechanical means. It is transferred by means that absolutely depend on what the receiver does and what the receiver wants. So you can be many people have been taught how to make fire and can't make one. And on the other hand, many people have learned how to make fire just by watching somebody making it. The historic chess grandmaster Capablanca learned how to play chess at the age of 4 just by watching, never having been told the moves. And the first that his father knew about it was when he told his father he'd made a illegal move. So he learned. He wanted to learn, and he was forming conceptions and theories in his mind about why these people were sitting at that board with bits of wood and moving them around and taking it so seriously.
Yeah.
He got that idea in his mind that this was interesting, and he thought about it, and his first series will certainly have been wrong. But he criticized them by further watching. And if they had told him, that would have played exactly the same role. If he had been told some of the rules, then again, he would have tested his existing conception of what the rules were against what they were saying. And sometimes they would have been saying something ambiguous, and he would have had to resolve the ambiguity by testing his theory against, like, what were they trying to say? Oh, they were trying to say you do that when you have moved your pawns. Okay, you can't move the rook until you have moved your pawn. That's what they mean.
Yeah,
or you might
sure.
have an idea that's wrong, and again, you test it against what they're saying, and
Okay,
that
so
is the
then
role of the other person.
So then, just forgive me if this is naive, but suppose somebody just burst into this room right now, came up to me and said that, I don't know, the definition of a bachelor is someone who's unmarried, and then they left. And suppose I didn't know what a bachelor was before that. And okay, I suppose you also have to assume that the person who burst in is someone knowledgeable. Let's say that it's my friend in the next room who's writing a dictionary. They're a lexicographer. And they sort of burst into the room and they go, Alex, a bachelor is a word meaning someone who's unmarried. And then they leave the room. I feel like I've just learned something. like I've just been educated in some respect. I don't feel like I've brought really anything to the table there. I feel like someone has just like placed that into the bucket and now I know it. But how would you characterize that specific instance of learning in a
So
way that indicates
yeah.
my role as the learner?
So you've chosen a situation in which both of you have a huge amount of shared knowledge to begin with. You know that he's a lexicographer and he's
Hmm.
trying to investigate the meaning of words and so on. Then he rushes in. I don't know why he thinks you don't know what a bachelor is, but perhaps you happen to not know. And he tells you it's someone who's unmarried. That's wrong. It's a man who's unmarried. So uh, it um, you will then criticize that theory that you think he told you. He thought that he was telling you only about the unmarried part, and you already knew about the man part.
Mm.
That perhaps because of the previous context or even a previous conversation, you had been wondering about the exact meaning of bachelor,
Hmm.
and now he comes in and he tells you in from his point of view, he's telling you the thing that we were both missing before. But you, hearing it, think that he's telling you the full definition, and he wasn't. And those things were not stated, they were
Mm.
guessed. Both of you guessed
Mm.
something, and it so happens you guessed incompatible things, only one of which was right. But a more realistic um, scene would have you both being wrong initially, because it would usually mean, it would usually continue along the lines of, "Are you saying that so and so?" And then he would say, "No, no, I'm actually saying so and so." And then you would say, "Ah, I see. You're trying to solve the problem of this." And he'd be saying, "Yeah," and so on. So there'd be a to and
Yeah,
fro.
like, oh, there's a great irony in the fact that I actually just mistook the definition in my example. Oh, a bachelor is someone who's unmarried. Oh, really? So like my sister's a bachelor. Oh, no, no, no. It's only men who are unmarried. It's like, oh, my granddad died a couple of years ago, so he must be a bachelor now because he's
Right.
dead, so he's not married. It's like, no, no, that's not quite what I mean either. And like the only reason why you escape those kinds of conversations is because you've already taken a guess at the fact that
Yes.
he's not referring to dead people, and that when he says men, he means living men, and he means
Yes. Fully grown men as well.
yeah, right, quite. And so there are assumptions that one brings to the table, I suppose, is, is,
Yes.
is what we're talking about here. And what we're talking about here as well is me and the way that I develop beliefs, right? Education, again, naively, is the means through which knowledge is passed on from one person to another. We've just demonstrated the fact that a lot of the time in this transmission of knowledge, there are mistakes, there is guesswork, there's all kinds of stuff going on. So, without trying to sound too sort of pseudo profound, what is knowledge? Like, I've talked about it before. Famously, philosophers have tried to define knowledge and found it very, very difficult. And I'm not necessarily looking for a precise definition, but suppose I have a belief. I believe that it's raining outside. And suppose that tomorrow I know that it's raining outside. What is the difference between those two mental states?
Yes. Well, incidentally, and we can come back to this, I don't think there really is such a thing as belief. Or if there is, then it's a very irrational state.
Hmm.
Um, but to answer your question, first of all, knowledge is a type of information. It's a subset of information, and it's specifically the kind of information that can have a causal effect. So the I can let's say I can buy a lottery ticket with a serial number on it, and then I can tell you the serial number, and so I've passed on a bit of information. That doesn't have a causal effect in itself, because it could have been any other number I told you, and it would have no different effect on you than that other number. It's only relevant if it's going to have an effect on somebody, like the people running the lottery. If it has an effect on them, then I can tell you but then it's not enough that I tell you the number. I have to tell you this is the winning number of a lottery. And the lottery in question is the British National Lottery. And you better cash it in before this evening, because that's the deadline. Otherwise, again, it doesn't have the power to have an effect. And this power of knowledge to have an effect is, if we take an even bigger perspective than going back 2 million years to early humans, if we go back to the context that there is life on Earth and not anywhere else that we can see, though there may well be life where we can't see it, then there is something fundamentally different about the information on Earth from anywhere else, because the information on Earth can have a huge effect on physical processes. So somebody can have an idea, and this idea can deflect an asteroid that's heading towards the Earth and thus prevent a mass extinction. Again, in whenever it was 800 million years ago, when blue-green algae evolved the knowledge. This is Popperian kind of conception of knowledge, which includes knowledge that isn't known to a person, but is nevertheless information that has a causal effect.
Right.
They had the evolution discovered a way of harnessing sunlight to make energy, and it had the side effect of creating oxygen. And as a result, the blue-green algae, that one gene, which began as a mutation in one precursor of blue-green algae, then spread as they multiplied, and then they made more oxygen, and the amount of oxygen they made exceeds by a factor of 10 to the 40 the mass of that mutated gene. So nothing like that happens anywhere else other than the Earth. Everywhere other than the Earth, the big massive thing affects the small non-massive thing, period. The small thing doesn't affect the big thing, barely affects it, doesn't noticeably affect it. So, a comet hits the sun, the comet is destroyed, the sun is basically going to carry on doing what it was going to do anyway. On the surface of the Earth, I call that the hierarchy rule. The hierarchy rule holds wherever there isn't knowledge. Where there is knowledge, the hierarchy rule is reversed. And we've only just begun on this journey of reversing the hierarchy rule, and we've only done it slightly on Earth. So when we've done it by a factor of 10 to the 40, we'll be commanding the galaxy.
So could you approximate a definition of knowledge? Like when you say the word knowledge, what roughly are you talking about? Or do you just really, are you quite allergic to definitions?
I'm somewhat allergic. I wouldn't want to use what I just said as a definition. It should be the other way around. There is this thing that reverses causality and so on. Let's give it a name. You call it Fred if you like.
Right, okay. It's a label.
Yeah, it's a label. But then there's also knowledge, the concept of knowledge as it has existed in philosophy, where there you've got to distinguish between perverse, downright wrong conceptions of knowledge and conceptions of knowledge which are closely related to this ability to reverse the direction of causality. So if knowledge is, again, I'm quoting Popper all the time, but what can you do? For thousands of years, philosophers thought that, or defined, some people have disputed that as well, but at any rate, they thought of knowledge as being a justified and true belief. So you just said, what's the difference between when I just thought it was true and then I knew it was true? The traditional answer has been because it has attained some justification. like you've proved it, or you've observed it by personal experience, or somebody has told you whom you trust, and that kind of thing. And that's just wrong. The nothing is ever justified in that sense. Nothing is even ever true in that sense, because we're always like improving our knowledge, like with the like with the Bachelor.
Yeah, yeah,
We
right.
can improve it, and we can improve it again, and then one day the concept will be useless, and everybody will forget what a bachelor is, just as they have now forgotten what a farrier is.
Yeah. What
100
is what
years
is a
ago,
what is a
everyone
farrier?
knew. It has to do
What?
with horseshoes.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. I've got no reason for that. But then, in the Enlightenment spirit, I do like knowledge for its own sake. So I'll go and look that up. Um, this idea of justified true belief, as you say, it's for a long time the definition of knowledge, because like I could believe that it's raining outside with no justification or with a bad justification, like
Yes.
a a witch told me that it was going to rain today. And if it just happens to be true that it's raining outside, lucky me, but it still doesn't feel like I know that it's raining. So it has to be a belief I hold which is both true and also justified. Because if it's justified and false, it's not knowledge either. And yeah, and then you get Edmund Gettier coming in, and I've spoken, if people are interested in the theory of knowledge, I've got a video on my channel. I think it's called something like How One Man Changed Philosophy by Accident or something like that, because he sort of goes to publish this like 2-page long paper that undermines justified true belief. But the big problem for me in this whole discussion is this difference between belief and knowledge. And like you say, something can be seemingly true, but then not true. And if suppose like until Einstein came along, we were all operating on a Newtonian understanding of the laws of physics. And so we knew things like objects of bigger mass will attract other objects with a bigger force of gravity. And we knew that was true, that we knew that was the case. When Einstein gives us a different picture of what gravity is and how it works, it still remains true that objects of a bigger mass exert more of a force. But I'm like, does that mean that we actually didn't know that before? Because although it's like the same conclusion, it was sort of based on totally
So,
different premises. It
so
kind of seems to me like we still knew it, but maybe it's more right to say that we didn't. And as soon as I start asking questions like that, the concept of what knowledge even is just kind of falls apart. I'm like, I
right.
kind of firstly don't really care, and secondly, I don't know how I would even possibly define it.
So first of all, defining knowledge as being truth, it is doomed from the beginning, because we never have truth in that sense.
But what do you mean by that when
We
you said that a moment ago? We never have truth.
Well, we can have, when we have a theory like, um, a bachelor is an unmarried person,
Hmm.
that contains truth. That is, it has useful consequences that might be the only consequences you need for your particular application. But it's not true. And like Bertrand Russell and Whitehead spent 300 pages or whatever it was proving that 1 + 1 is 2.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and then it was realized that you can't define things by axioms anyway, because there's no such thing as proving that an axiom system is consistent. Gödel
Yeah.
proved that.
Yes. The
So
Gödel's
there is
incompleteness
yes.
theorem.
So this search for justified truth, even in pure mathematics, where you might think that, true, there's unambiguous truth about numbers 2 and 1 and equals and plus and so on, but it's not true. That whole system is just a conjecture.
Okay, so to be clear, when you say we can't have truth, you're not implying that, there is no truth and
No,
truth and
no.
falsity. You mean literally that we can't have it. It's there. It's just that we can
Yes,
never have it because we'll only have
yes,
something like half truth. So for example, um, if I said to somebody, like every every Homo sapiens, every human being under the age of 6 is an ape. That's true,
yes.
but it's like there's something missing from that picture. It's kind of misleading. It's going to lead us into all sorts of trouble if I'm not more clear. And so, okay, what I mean to say is that every human being is an ape, but then that itself will rely on understandings of what like taxonomy is and categories, and if you really want to get the fullness of truth in every possible respect that could even possibly be relevant to that statement, you'd probably basically require like infinite knowledge, right? Because you would need
Absolutely.
to understand how language works, you'd need to understand taxonomy, you'd need to understand like the philosophy of taxonomy, you'd need to understand whether objects can exist, you need to study mereology and parts, and you'd need to know all of this.
Exactly.
The only reason that we don't, on a practical level, need that is because on a practical level, we only ever go so deep.
We only ever go as deep as is needed to solve the problem that we're currently solving.
I see. And so knowledge becomes relatively practical because if you can't have knowledge in the sense that the philosophers define it, then when people are talking about things that they know, they're getting at something slightly different, which is like a practical certainty or a practical confidence, maybe.
Well, practical is the wrong word because it need not be have any practical application, as in vacuuming your carpet.
Yeah.
It might be an issue of pure mathematics. It might be an issue of pure mathematics that only you are interested in,
Right.
and yet it's still knowledge.
Yeah.
What we are seeking is knowledge, but it's not truth. We can find knowledge in the sense that we can correct existing knowledge by removing errors. So, and that's what the growth of knowledge always is. It's always removing errors. When I realize what you meant by first left and second right, it's by removing the misconception that I had before. It's not that what you told me is false, or that the idea that I had is entirely false through and through. It contained truth. Both of them contained truth. Both of them contained error. To get to my destination, it's enough if I remove errors to the extent that they are relevant to the problem that I want to solve.
Mm. Is there anything that you know is true, like in the Cartesian sense of I think therefore I am, and maybe that's all I can know with certainty, but like is there anything that comes to mind that you
No,
could
and
say I know?
I don't. I think Descartes was. I can think of things that are more certain than that, which are still not certain. There is no such thing as certain truth. Descartes was already assuming that such a thing as I exists, and yet these experiments with memory. First of all, memory is in any case consists of confabulation. So when we remember something, what we're really doing is conjecturing what happened using the structures in our brain as clues to test our conjectures against. And this process is fallible. And in particular, the statement, I think, is extremely fallible because there are now experiments you can do to show that people have false memories of having thought something that they couldn't possibly have thought because they didn't know the thing they were thinking about, that they thought they were thinking about at the time.
That sounds like a minefield. And again, I do actually have a video on Descartes' I think therefore I am, which is I think a more complicated phrase than people give it credit for. And there are different interpretations of, is Descartes doing like a syllogism? I think, premise, therefore, conclusion, I exist. Or is it like a singular intuition of the mind? That's a relevant question here. I discussed that in that video. What I'm really interested in, because my ears are still perked from this, you told me that you don't believe in belief.
Yeah, there are states of mind that can be called belief. I think irrational ones, like somebody who believes in some religion or something. What they mean is that they have a resistance, and they are hoping it's a complete resistance to changing a certain idea. And when we're talking about belief in the world, first of all, in Popper's conception, rational thought consists of conjecture and criticism. just alternating those, like in evolution, we have mutation and selection. So we have in rational thought, we have conjecture and criticism. And the first thing to notice is that belief is neither of those. So Popper has this pithy quotation. See if I can remember it. Belief, belief is never rational. Suspension of belief is rational. So, in order to create knowledge about something, you've got to stop believing at least something. I mean, but it doesn't help to believe anything. You can have a theory, an idea, and you can not know any criticisms of it. Like, I don't know any criticisms of the idea that the street outside my house still exists. And if I'm going to base any action on that, on the fact that I don't have evidence of that yet, then I'm going to have to. There's an infinity of other things that I could act on, and many of them will be the opposite action to that action. So the only, but I have a conjecture that exists, and I don't have a good explanation that can count as a criticism of it. So when I don't have a criticism of something and it is a good explanation, then the rational thing to do is not to contradict it. I only contradict it if I have a good explanation of why it might not be true, why it might, or rather, why it might not be knowledge, why it might contain an error. So belief is unhelpful in this context because it views it's kind of it's, people sometimes say that some branches of science have physics envy, and then some branches of philosophy have science envy. And I think that the belief in belief may have originated in ancient times as a sort of logic envy, because it was once, at least when Aristotle formalized logic, but probably even before that, people saw this deduction going on, and you could have a definition of prime numbers, and then you could prove something you didn't know before just by applying this method, deduction. And so you start with the thing that you know, you apply a method, and you end up with the thing you didn't know, and it's just as secure as the thing you started with. Of course it isn't, but because the axioms could be wrong. And you might think the axioms are self-evident, but they're not. And the thing that people held up...
Could those axioms be wrong? Like, I mean, like that, take, 2 + 2 being 4. I mean, it seems like the word equals there, or the equal symbol is functioning as an indication of tautology. Like, it's sort of like saying, P equals P, or like, my iPhone equals my iPhone. So I consider something like 2 + 2 = 4 to be essentially a tautology of that kind. Do you think that my iPhone is my iPhone is something that can be known, or is that an axiom that might be wrong? And if it is, doesn't that have some like radical implications for the way that we rely on logic?
Not really. It's just that you're focusing on a particular use case in which you can't think of a way in which it couldn't be true in that use case.
Sure.
But if you have a 6-year-old relative who has just gone into primary school, first grade or whatever they call it, and they were given the problem sheet. Horrific use of the word problem, by the way. Problem sheet on which it says 1 + 1 =, and then a box where you're supposed to write the answer. And your young friend wrote in the box 1 plus 1 and it was marked wrong,
Mm.
and you said that that's not the answer they wanted, right?
Hmm.
And he says, but it's a tautology. How can it be wrong? So, um,
Yeah, that's interesting. But then I think that the student would just be, although of course in that context, you know what they're getting at. The teacher, if they were being, you know, correct, if they weren't making a mistake, they would have to say, yes, that is correct, but I'd like to see it expressed in a different way. Like
so
if the kid wrote, like, you know, 1 plus 1 equals, and then wrote in the box 4 divided by 2, the teacher might be kind of impressed and be like, whoa, hey, here's
yes.
an extra point, you know. But to say
Well,
that it's like the wrong answer could only refer to the context. It can't refer to the actual truth of the answer itself.
it. So you can. This issue of the context just
Hmm.
repeats the same problem. You can never express with perfect precision what the context is.
Hmm.
The chances are that any child who gets that question wrong is getting it wrong because they have the wrong context in mind.
Mm.
I would guess that it's very rare to get that wrong because you actually don't know what 1 plus 1 is, in the sense of knowing what the teacher means by asking you what 1 plus 1 is, and also
Sure.
not knowing what 1 plus 1 actually is.
Yep.
So that combination must be quite rare.
Sure.
So usually, getting something wrong in that sense is either not understanding the thing, in other words, having a misconception about the thing, or having a misconception about the problem situation that you have been put in.
Hmm.
It's the same issue as before. You'll never define bachelor perfectly. You'll never define plus perfectly or equals, as Russell and Whitehead will tell you, or rather they would now. They thought they could do it, and it took them
Yeah.
300 pages.
In a way, I hadn't considered the assumption I bring to the word equals, because, well, 1 plus 1
Yes,
equals 2. Well, does it? Because those aren't the same thing. They represent,
exactly.
I guess, the same idea, but they're not actually the same
Yes,
the same thing in the sense of how they're expressed. You know,
exactly.
like yeah. I mean, 1 plus 1 is the same as 1 plus 1. It's got the same value as 2, but it's not the same thing.
Yes,
It's not the same expression. It's not got the same label on it. It's not got the same number of, like, pen strokes. So you need to understand the context in which you mean is the same as,
yes,
in order
and
to
even that
even answer
can't
that
be
question.
defined perfectly.
Yes. Interesting. Okay. I want to change gears. I don't often do sort of janky segues, but we were talking before about kind of science, and there's somewhere we didn't take the conversation, which discourse on knowledge interestingly shelved. I really wanted to speak to you about this today. This is the main thing I wanted to ask you about, which is that reading The Beginning of Infinity, there's this idea that pervades. If you ask somebody what is science, what does science do? I think the most common answer for someone who knows a thing or two about science is to say, well, what science does is it makes predictions. That's how we know if scientific theories are accurate. That's their purpose, is in order to make predictions about the future. Einstein proved general relativity by, making a prediction about the eclipse and it coming true. And so that's what science really does. You disparage this idea. You say that science cannot be about prediction.
Yes.
Why not?
It can't be only about predictions, though, but prediction is one of the characteristic methods of science.
Hmm.
Uh, to be exact, testing theories by testing their predictions is one of the characteristic methods of science. But it is not the purpose of science, partly because, as we said last time, you can have two theories that make the same predictions, but one of them is a cope, as you put it. By the way, I've
Yeah.
enjoyed using that.
The
Uh,
Copenhagen
exactly.
interpretation. Yeah.
And the trouble with that is not that it makes wrong predictions, is that it stultifies and freezes progress in
Hmm.
in in physics in this case, but in science generally. Um, uh, science is about explaining the world. It's about knowing what is there behind the appearances. So we know that the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening. Originally, we didn't know why, but we knew that that happened. As we found out what happened, we realized that it wasn't even true that it rises in the morning and sets in the evening. It's that the world isn't at rest, that the earth isn't at rest beneath our feet. That's an astounding way of explaining the observed in terms of the unobserved, the perceived things according to imperceptible things. And that's how science makes progress. The progress in science is progress in understanding how the world is, not in what predictions we'll make. Yeah, and my other example that I use is about conjuring tricks. You know, if you go to a Penn and Teller show and you see them doing a trick, and they're going to saw through a lady, and then you can predict that the appearance will be that they saw through the lady, but you know that that can't be the underlying reality. But you absolutely can't think of how it could possibly not be, because they have apparently refuted all your conjectures as to how they created the illusion. So then you're in a state of perplexity. And this is the state in which scientists are in regard to the world. They are captivated by perplexity, that they do not know what is causing the appearances behind the scenes.
Yes, like what is causing matter to hold together? What is causing the sun to rise, quote unquote?
Yes.
These are the appearances, and the scientist is engaged in the undiscovered qualities that are making that happen.
And
that are the explanation for it.
And typically we do not observe that underlying mechanism. Nobody has ever seen the inside of the sun, but we know that it's there in reality. It's not a reality. Maybe this is a reality that no one will ever experience, but we know that it's there, and that is in our worldview as a thing that's as real as what we see the sun doing in the morning, because they're inextricable. There's an explanation of the one from the other that is so good that it can't be replaced by anything that we can think of.
Now, my problem with this, or my sort of the reason why I can't get on board with this, is because I've developed a view of what science is and what science does that is more in line with this other view, which typically is called instrumentalism. That what science does is essentially make predictions and describe things, but doesn't actually explain anything. The reason I think that, for an example, is when Isaac Newton discovers gravity. We've known that we've known that objects fall as long as we've been alive, but no one's known why that's the case. And then Isaac Newton comes along and scientifically explains gravity. He realizes that the same thing causing me to fall to the ground on Earth is the same thing that keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth itself.
Yeah, I don't think the first thing you said is true, but the second, yes, he unified celestial mechanics and terrestrial mechanics, but he didn't explain what gravity was.
Oh, wait, so this is where I'm going, is that this is the picture people have of, like, Newton comes along and he explains gravity because gravity is an inverse square law and objects attract each other across a difference, and so there we have it. That's science, and we've got this theory of gravitation. But I have a quote from Isaac Newton, actually, and I think it's relatively well known, but he writes this in the general scholium to the Principia Mathematica, after sort of explaining, describing how gravity works, all of the mathematical theorems and stuff. He says, "I have not yet been able to discover the cause of these properties of gravity from phenomena, and, as he puts it in Latin, hypotheses non fingo. I feign no hypothesis. It is enough that gravity does really exist and acts according to the laws which we have explained, and is sufficient to explain all the motions of the celestial bodies." So Newton just forthrightly admits that He has explained the laws, as he puts it, which are the mathematical properties by which gravity abides, but says, if you ask me what gravity actually is, like why gravity exists, why these mathematical laws are doing what they're doing, I frame no hypothesis. I've got no bloody clue, in modern English. Now, when I look at what science sort of does, and at root its so-called explanations of phenomena, I'm seeing a lot of what looks to me like this Newtonian description rather than an actual explanation. That is a view known as instrumentalism, broadly, of what science actually is. Are there any sort of obvious counterexamples that can just prove to me once and for all right now that I'm wrong about that?
Well, proof is not available in philosophy, unfortunately.
Sure.
But I think, as you guessed, I'm very much opposed to instrumentalism, and I don't think it's true as a philosophical theory. And I think that Newton didn't know. Newton didn't know about Popper. The kind of theory of knowledge that Newton was applying, and which he uncritically assumed must be true retrospectively of what he has been doing, was just false. He was false about himself, just as the people who, in these experiments with the brain stimulation, think they remember themselves thinking a certain thing which they couldn't possibly have thought. So Newton, having only inductivism as his philosophy of knowledge, thought that he had applied inductivism, and therefore thought that he had done nothing more than make a better predictive theory.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not true. So you said yourself, and I agree, that at least I think is the main thing he did. He unified celestial and terrestrial mechanics. And that is an explanatory theory. It's not just a predictive theory. You could have a theory of celestial mechanics and a theory of terrestrial mechanics and never realize that they're the same, because they might be expressed in different terminologies. They weren't in the case of Newton.
But to be clear, you're talking, when you say celestial and terrestrial mechanics, you're talking about like the way that objects fall to the ground and fly through the air on Earth versus the way that objects do it in space, like planets and stars and stuff.
Yes. That is explanatory because it adds something to the predictions. Somebody could have two theories, and then unifying them is a form of explanation. Now, we can also see even better what an explanation is in the case of gravity, because, another thing I should add, Newton had to postulate some invisible things, which was explanatory. He had to postulate that there were forces, invisible forces, that act on matter and which were caused by other matter. And again, that was not part of the equations. That was part of the words that went with the equations, that there are invisible forces.
Yes,
And
I've always
Newton,
found that word force to be incredibly, like, kind of comic, like a bit funny, because when we look at how, the ancients thought that, Aristotle thought that objects just longed to be with the earth. How silly, how ridiculous these ideas of mythical spirituality and the gods pushing stuff. No. Today, with our modern science, we've updated it and we've got forces. Yeah, that explains forces. And we've gotten so used to the idea of a scientific forces as a term that it sounds normal. But like, if you think about what that means, like, it's sort of spooky and mystical. Forces, that explains everything. But to me, that's just as much of a sort of mythical guesswork as anything else.
It's not the same as the angel theory, because the angel theory can't be tested. The forces theory, although it's wrong, but it's got a lot more knowledge in it than the angel theory had, because it makes testable predictions. But not only, it also unifies our conceptions, which before that were we conceptualized the space outside the Earth differently from the space on the surface of the Earth. And Newton, with this notion of force, which exists both on the surface of the Earth and in the sky, according to his theory, that unified them. And again, there were all these. This is what characterizes a scientific explanation. Not all explanation, but a scientific explanation. It explains the seen in terms of the unseen. So the unseen were the forces, and the seen were the planets and the apples falling. And then when Einstein came along, first of all, he said there are no forces associated with gravity. That's stunningly counterintuitive, but it's got nothing to do with what anyone observes. Instead, it has to do with his theory that space and time form a unified fabric which is itself dynamic. No one has ever seen space-time. No one has ever seen it curving.
Mhm.
This is all part of the unseen part of the theory of relativity, which explains, yes, it explains the seen part 1% more accurately than Newton did. But that's not what it's for. What it's for is understanding the world. Well, by the way,
Mhm.
I shouldn't downplay Einstein, because when it comes to things like the Big Bang and black holes and gravitational waves and so on, it's more than 1% better. It's like
Right.
revolutionarily better.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
And satellite technology and all of this kind of
yes,
stuff.
yes,
It's yeah,
GPS, which depends on
yes,
why do you have to include relativity in GPS? Because it won't give the right answer. But why won't
yes.
it give you the right answer? Because there are no gravitational forces. I say this even to physicists sometimes, and they say, "Well, there are gravitational." Well, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
doesn't.
I
You can't say something approximately exists.
That's one of the
You
things that I like about this Einsteinian shift, and it's the most common example given of in any context of humans changing their mind is Newton was wrong and Einstein got it right, right? But the most interesting thing to me is this doing away, like Newton's big problem is like I've got this mathematical system that describes the motion of the planets, but I just got no idea what it is. There's some force, and I don't know what it is. I don't know where it comes from. And Einstein, instead of answering the question of where it came from, just says, "Wrong question. There is no such thing." But that's why I'm like, is it a better when you say that Newton unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics, and he said, well, he realized that the same mathematics apply
But not
to
just the same mathematics.
right because I was trying to
The
get at
same
is
invisible things cause both effects.
suppose Newton didn't come up with the word forces. Suppose Newton just realized, the only thing he realized is that the same mathematics that describes celestial mechanics also describes terrestrial mechanics. Suppose that's all he did. And somebody said, well, why is that? And he's like, I don't know. And they're like, do you think there's some kind of force? And he's like, I don't know. All I know is that the same mathematics describes it. And that's all that he'd realized without positing this false idea of forces. Would he still have been doing science? Because in that case, it seems like he really was just describing something.
Well, whether he was doing science depends more on what he was aspiring to do. Like,
Mhm.
even if he had failed to find a better law of motion of planets or whatever, he would still have been doing science, because he would have been trying to explain the world. He would have been trying to find an explanation of the motion of planets and so on,
But
which
hypothetically he really was just trying to describe it. Like that's all he was trying to do. Would that just mean
uh,
that he wasn't doing science anymore?
I think yes. In that case, I mean, one could argue that he would never have succeeded, because how would he be any different from Descartes? Like,
Mhm.
also Descartes was trying to explain the same thing using vortices. Okay,
Yeah.
forget about the vortices. Just try to explain the planets. Well, okay, he could give you a big, thick tome of planetary observations and say that's my theory.
Mhm.
Okay, it's perfectly accurate. It explains everything that's ever been observed, but it's not a theory. That's not what Descartes was trying to do.
Mhm.
He was trying to explain the seen in terms of the unseen, and so was Newton. They could have both arrived at the same equations, but This is like, saying that it's a good idea to break your leg because after you broke your leg, you went to hospital and you fell in love with the woman of your dreams in the hospital, and so on. Therefore, breaking your leg is a good thing.
Mhm.
It the It's not common to find a thing you're not looking for, and when it's even less common to find a thing without looking for any improvement. You might be looking for one improvement and find another. That's the thing that sometimes happens, like with penicillin.
Mhm.
Um, but when you're not looking for improvement, then you're like those prehistoric people who had a campfire and did sometimes drop their food into it, but they didn't think this could be a better way of life. We could
Mm.
cook things. Wow, just that idea. They didn't know why food tastes better,
Yeah.
but they could imagine a better way of life than the one they had. They could imagine this invisible thing that made the food taste better, improving their life and improving what they then observed.
So I have this, like in trying to encapsulate how I feel about science and the particularly the issue of science, like explaining everything one day and explaining the origin of the universe and stuff like this. My listeners will be sick of hearing it because I bring it up all the time. But I think it's relevant to bring up again here because we're talking about the very thing that the analogy encapsulates. When I say it to like a Christian, they tend to really, really like it and think it's cool. When I say it to a scientist, they're a bit more suspicious. So I think I can now predict how you would answer to it, but to put it in a more concrete term, right? So I often talk about discovering out in the wild a book of Shakespearean sonnets. And I'm imagining somebody who says, look, science will one day explain the origin of the universe, and one day we'll have a theory of everything. One day science will explain all of the or not all of the questions because there will always be questions, but it will answer lots of the big questions we have right now, at least in principle.
Yes.
And I'm imagining discovering this book of Shakespearean sonnets on the floor, not knowing what it is or where it came from, and being like, I wonder what this thing is. And we look at it, and some clever clog starts pouring through it, and they notice that at the end of every single like sentence or line or whatever, there's a bigger version of the same letter, the capital letter. And they discover this thing which they call the law of capitalization. For some reason, there's this law that every new sentence has a big version of the letter. Then they discover the laws of punctuation. Then they might get really clever and discover the law of iambic pentameter, the rhythm that the words have, and they realize that there's a rhythm to it, and that this is the law of iambic pentameter. And someone comes along and says, why is that law that way? And they're like, we're not really sure, but we're working on it. And then somebody says, look, I've got all of these laws of literacy that I've discovered. And somebody says, where did the book come from then? And the experimenter goes, well, I don't know yet, but look at all the progress that we've made with these literary laws. I'm sure one day we'll be able to explain the origin of the book. That would be a category error. And the reason that I use that analogy is because it's obvious in that instance that what the laws of literacy are really like doing there are just describing things we observe. They're not actually really explaining any of it. They're just describing it. And so the analogy is that this is kind of what scientists do with the law of gravity and the law of, electromagnetism or whatever, forgive my ignorance here. As I say, when I say that to like a Christian, they're like, wow, that's a really good way of putting it. I'm pretty convinced you're not going to be quite so impressed by that analogy, and I'm interested in
Right.
why that's the case.
Well, for a start, I think you're unnecessarily disparaging these people. All knowledge begins with myth, dogma. Science begins with unscientific things. Before these prehistoric people wondered what raises the sun into the sky, they first had to think that something does, or that the sun does rise in the morning and set in the evening. That is something they didn't know when they were born. They learned that at some point, or to be exact, they guessed it at some point, and only then did they begin to try to explain it in terms of angels and so on. Now, this regularity of the sun crossing the earth in itself, it is nothing. It's not science. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't tell you anything about the sun or the earth or anything. It's proto-science. This is how wondering about those things and then caring about whether the explanation is actually true or whether it really does correct errors in your previous conception. That's how science begins. And then only after that do you form ideas that actually meet that criterion of being better explanations than before. So you then wonder, how far away is the sun? How big is it really? And you can't ask that question until you know about measuring things. And so to take it to your analogy about the Shakespeare sonnets, the first thing that's unfair is that you're unfairly disparaging these people who are doing the right thing in this strange universe in which you can just find a book of sonnets and be mystified by how such a thing could possibly exist. But in that strange world, they are doing the right thing, and they will, if they keep trying, they will get to more things, because they will find more regularities that they will eventually learn to decipher. I assume these people are French or something. They can't speak English.
Yeah,
So they
I
don't
suppose
know
maybe. Or maybe they're time travelers from a time before writing or something,
Yeah, something like
whatever
that.
you
So
like.
they all they're seeing is the printing and the full stops and that kind of thing. But they might guess. One of them might guess that these things have a meaning. That they were not put there by evolution. They were put there by creative thought, and then they might decipher what it means, and then they might see that there are similarities in the meaning of different sonnets, even though they're expressed in different words, and so on and so on. By continuing along those lines, they could eventually work out what the words mean, what the sonnets mean, why they would disagree with some of them, they would agree with others, and so they would be creating knowledge of what unseen thing caused the seen thing. And it wasn't, they weren't just satisfied with being able to predict. They were dissatisfied until they discovered the reason for the regularities, the reason why sentences aren't longer than a certain length, the reason why there were the same kind of phonemes at the ends of words, certain words and not other words. They'd realized that there are inexplicit ideas as well as the explicit ones. I could go on about what poetry is, but there's no reason why they can't discover it. And that's the kind of thing, if they spend their lives analyzing this book, that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for these regularities as you imagine them and as you imagine Newton and Descartes looking for. That's not what they were looking for. They wanted to know what is in the world that causes these appearances, the same as what your imaginary scientists would be looking for. That's the reason that they're spending their lives trying to analyze this book rather than trying to analyze the exact pattern of sand on a sandy beach.
Yeah, so a bit like how a sort of prehistoric person might have discovered that if they put food on the fire, that it cooks and hardens it, right? And so they can like predict that with regularity that if I put this bit of meat on the fire, it will harden and it will be chewy. But even in developing a very sort of rigorous prediction policy that is routinely confirmed, they're not doing science because they haven't explained anything and they don't care to explain anything. They're just making predictions.
Yes, but as I said, they can explain the role that this might play in their future diet.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's already an explanation that they have not observed.
Sure, I see, and I suppose, yeah, the person who's uncovering the Shakespearean sonnet is eventually going to do more than just make predictions about what they're going to see on the next page.
Absolutely.
They're going to want to know why that's the case.
Yes.
And that is the defining quality of science.
Yes.
Because again, that analogy with the conjuring trick, the magic trick on stage, we kind of brushed over that a second ago. I meant to really emphasize this for people listening because I think it's really interesting in spelling out this distinction. You can predict the outcome of a magic trick. If a magician puts a ball in a cup,
yeah,
and like moves it to the left-hand side of the table, you can predict that the ball's actually going to be in the right-hand side of the table because it's a magic trick. And you can predict that with accuracy, but the whole point is that even then, you have no idea how he did it. It's a bit like, I mean, I've seen a Penn and Teller show. One of the things that Penn and Teller do well, actually, is they manage to know that you do predict the outcome and still subvert it.
Right.
So, I mean, they'll sort of go like, so where's the cup? And the clever audience will just know that they're doing a trick and go, well, I bet it's on the unexpected one. And they're like, nah, come on, like, use your brain. It's where I put it. So, again, there are assumptions brought to the table. My favorite, they made an elephant, quote unquote, disappear. And the way they did it was they dressed up a cow as an elephant. They'd been talking all night about how they were going to disappear an elephant. And it was a bit, you kind of think they can't be serious. And then there's a cow on stage that's dressed up as an elephant. And it's like, okay, very funny and all. And then they cover up the elephant, quote unquote. And they say, now what's going to happen is the elephant's going to disappear and it's going to be replaced with a common farmyard animal. And okay, very funny. But then they drop the curtain and it's been just replaced with a chicken. The cow dressed up as the elephant has disappeared, and it's just a chicken that's on stage.
Yeah.
So it's like this great Gettier case of justified true belief that you're about to see a farmyard animal, but managing to subvert that expectation. But again, in fact, to be fair, when I was watching that show and they made the joke about the common farmyard animal, I actually thought to myself, I bet they're making a joke and it is actually about to be replaced with something like a chicken. So I predicted the outcome of that event. I have absolutely no clue how on earth they did it. So prediction is not the same thing as explanation, and if all I can do is predict the outcome of a magic trick, that's pretty uninteresting either to somebody who wants to do magic themselves or cares about the mechanism of the magic show. And I suppose the scientist is the person who wants to know how the universe works, wants to do science, and wants to understand the mechanism of how things interact. I'm glad to end on a point of agreement there. I mean, I still need to do some more thinking about how this might affect my my view of what science is and what it does, and how it might one day explain the origins of the universe and all of that kind of good stuff. But at the very least, I think your book is quite confronting. I think that's one of the reasons it's so popular, is that there are all of these assumptions about what science is, instrumentalism, induction, what knowledge is, and belief. And your book just confronts all of these things and asks, as most good books do, like, are you sure about that? And it's a whirlwind, which I think is why it's so popular. And hopefully people have got a taste of it now, but I'll leave a link to that book in the description.
Cool.
When did the Beginning of Infinity come out?
2010? I can't remember now.
Sure. So over a decade ago. This isn't just like a book tour promotion. This has been sitting around for a while. I just want people to realize that I'm not just saying that because the publishers have asked me to. It really is a popular text that's become a bit of a modern classic. So I'll leave a link to that in the description. But thanks again for joining me. It's been another
thanks for having me.
Well-rounded
Fascinating conversation as usual.
Yeah, and hopefully at some point we can perhaps do it again, because as I'm sure will always be the case, no matter how many times we ever sit down, there is more to talk about. So Until the next time, I suppose.
Yes.
Rhett McLaughlin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
I can't believe you nearly made us change this tabletop to something cleaner.
We do have something that's more professional.
This is beautiful.
I mean, welcome to our space.
Yeah, thanks for hosting me here. I usually open the show by saying something like, thanks for being here, or welcome to the show. And I've done that on a few occasions in other people's sets and other people's houses, and they kind of look at me a little bit blankly. So I'm sure you know what I mean, but thanks for having me. You got a lot of character on this table. This is like a who's who of
early YouTube.
Decades ago.
Yeah.
You were pointing out like the Fine Bros here, and I saw like I Just Seen over there. It's like a real old school thing. Why did it stop? What happened?
We kind of ran out of people to talk to.
It's
Honestly, the guest-based, we started our podcast as a guest-based show.
Yeah.
We thought that we would be like the Mark Maron for internet personalities.
sure.
There's two issues. Number one, there's only so many, especially back in the day, only so many interesting internet personalities to talk to
Mm.
that were also willing to come into our studio out here. And then there's some dynamic that happens when two people are interviewing one person.
Yeah.
And we were like, this is not.
Yeah, I've seen that kind of thing before. Like a lot of other shows have multiple hosts, but there's like one main guy maybe, but having two people, it's kind of tricky. There are podcasts that
Right.
do it.
Link and I are always both trying to be the main guy. That's our problem.
Yeah.
We've made a
It's
career
based
of
on
it,
you.
but
Yeah.
on a podcast,
It's the same thing interviewing two people. I've done that a few times as well, like when I had Cliff and Stuart Connectly on, and
Yeah.
they work quite well as a pair, but it's quite difficult to know like where to frame your
and we're
conversation.
on the other side of that quite a bit, right? I mean,
I
like
bet, yeah.
99% of any interviews that I'm a part of, Link's always right here. You know,
Yeah.
we have to sit as Rhett and Link. We're very precise about
Yeah,
it.
do you feel a bit naked, sat on your own in a situation?
No, I
like
enjoy
this?
it.
Yeah. Well, I prefer it this way because I also prefer being naked because especially with you because there's something that gets lost in if you really start getting into the weeds of a conversation with somebody and you start thinking, oh gosh, I better ask the other guy a
Right.
question. That you can avoid or sort of not manage to really get into the weeds with a particular person. Now, you have one of the biggest shows on YouTube with Good Mythical Morning. And in my experience, with any kind of YouTube followership, you can't say anything without annoying somebody. We've already offended somebody in the comment section. You, with one of the biggest shows on YouTube, decided not too long ago, a few years back, to start talking about your spiritual deconstruction, as you call it, and your move away from Christianity. That must have been quite the move for you. And it's one of the reasons I'm interested in speaking to you. And hopefully, I know you've spoken a bit about it on various shows and things, but my audience is really interested in philosophy and theology. I'm sure they're fascinated by some of the intricacies of your thoughts on this kind of stuff. But when you start thinking, I want to say something about this, like, why? You've got a good thing going, man. Why are you going to mess it up with all this religious stuff?
Yeah. Tell me about it. I started talking to Link about how I thought we needed to share our story, mostly because of how much we had disclosed about ourselves over the years. Our podcast, even starting with this, when we were interviewing people, we would ask all these really personal questions, ask them about their background. We would give a little bit of our background, but we would leave out this really foundational part of who we were. And then even in all the interviews that we would do about our career, we would basically, the story would go, so we went to engineering school, we were engineers for a while, and then we became YouTubers. It was a very simple, easy to understand story. When the reality was, well, all throughout that time, we were involved in Christian ministry. We were very involved with Campus Crusade for Christ. And in between being engineers and being professional YouTubers, we were professional Christians. We worked full-time with Campus Crusade for Christ as, campus missionaries, for lack of a better word. And our ministry was essentially using our comedy to help Christian students figure out how to talk about their faith. So we would literally, we didn't put on like big, bait and switch evangelistic shows that you were supposed to invite like non-Christians to. We were like, hey, let's do something where we kind of come into their typical weekly meeting and we do something fun that it's got music and video and that's helping them kind of see differently the way that they approach evangelism. And the only reason that I'm doing what I do today is because of my background, because of all the experience that we had coming up in that, in that setting. So it just felt disingenuous to not talk about it.
Yeah.
It just began to, it was like, it began to kind of press on me. Like, this is such a, and also in the meantime, I had been through this complete deconstruction and essentially a deconversion. And so it's like, I kind of have to tell the story of the background while simultaneously telling the story of why I no longer believe it.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like we got to go out there and like get on this. There was, by the way, not really a deconstruction train to get on at the time. It wasn't, I mean, there were some people who had talked about it, but I wasn't paying attention to that. I wasn't interested in that. I didn't know who had deconstructed publicly. I didn't know much about the word deconstruction. So it wasn't I want to be a part of a movement, or I see myself as part of a movement or a spokesperson for that. It was like, we need to be honest with our audience.
Yeah.
Let's just tell the story.
Campus Crusade for Christ.
Mhm.
What is that about?
Well, let's see if I can remember exactly, because I used to have to get up at the weekly meeting and say this. Campus Crusade for Christ is an interdenominational Christian organization founded in 1951 by Bill and Vonette Bright.
Wow.
Our philosophy is threefold: to win, build, and send. Win students to Christ, build them up in their faith, and send them out to continue the win, build, send process.
How's that working out for you?
Hey, it worked pretty well for a while, man.
Yeah. Well, you were pretty knowledgeable, right? Like, you would be able to talk to people and convert people. I mean, presumably that doesn't go away. Like, you've still got the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
You've still got it inside of you.
That the evangelical Christian part of my brain will never go away.
Yeah.
Is always there, judging the deconstructed Los Angeles YouTuber. You know, I think so. I whenever I see somebody talk about me, and I try not to do that very often.
Mhm.
Like, I know, just being on your podcast and talking about it, like, we get, you know this game very well. You give you give the material, you provide the material for all the Christian reaction channels.
Oh, sure.
This is what
yeah.
they feed off of, right? This is what they want. If we're talking about this, they want to talk about us talking about it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times I'm listening to myself say things and I'm like, oh, well, that's what they're going to say about this.
Yeah.
You know, and I try not to calculate that too much and think about, you can drive yourself crazy, like trying to like orchestrate all your words.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's something you're always aware of as a
Yeah.
public figure. Was most of the stuff that you were doing, like, was it biblical? Was it arguments for God's existence? Was it like, what kind of approach were you taking? What's your like expertise when it comes to evangelism?
So with Campus Crusade for Christ, we would share something called the 4 Spiritual Laws.
Mm.
And it was a little booklet, essentially, that Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade, had put together. And it was essentially a gospel tract. You know, God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. All people have sinned. And it's the gospel, right?
Yeah.
And 4 laws, 4 spiritual laws. It was very like 1950s Christianity, you know. But it was very effective because what it did is you had the ability, and of course I wouldn't like always break out the booklet. I would just, you know, maybe do it in the context of a conversation. But, you know, you might go out on, it sounds crazy when you think about it, but like we would go down to spring break at like Panama City Beach, and you got all these kids just partying on the beach. And we were like, well, we're going to go out on the beach and we're going to start spiritual conversations with people. And we're going to plant seeds in the least, and in the best case scenario, we're going to bring someone to a point of decision. That's what you want to do, you know, bring them to that point of decision, right? So a great question is, you know, if you were to die tonight, how certain are you that you would go to heaven, right? I mean, that's a great.
It's heavy.
It's heavy, and usually if like you're in the middle of partying in Panama City Beach and you're like drunk and you're so many students are sort of, you know, day 3, day 4 at spring break, and they've just been pumping themselves full of alcohol, and they're literally, some of them are still having a ball, but some of them are like actively realizing that there's no fulfillment in the excesses, right? And they're like, it's like the perfect time to approach them.
Man, it's quite an existential moment, really.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen a lot of interviews with drunk people on the streets, and it can go one of two ways. There are like the funny ones when people are vulnerable in the sense that they might say something a bit stupid or whatever, and it makes for a funny viral moment. But also, the the Christian outreach. I know people were doing that at my university too, where they used to sort of stand outside the nightclubs, and they weren't actually preaching or evangelizing. They would just hand out like water and biscuits and things. And I suppose it was like it's a Christian route, but
Yes.
it is. I mean, all of the vices sort of come out in a nightclub.
Yeah.
In the party atmosphere, everything about your inhibitions, and I feel like that is probably the place where Christ enters so many people. Like when people tell their stories about coming to Christianity, it's often that kind of situation, but writ large across their life. It's like I was in the dumps, I had nowhere to turn, and at the end of a night at the club, you're sort of in a sort of microcosm of a moment like that for the day. You know, you're tired, the lights have come on, and everything is suddenly really ugly. When I was in Las Vegas, I remember I've been there once, and I showed up at night, and I thought, this is the most incredible thing I've ever seen. It was glamorous, it was glittering, it was beautiful. And then the morning I woke up relatively early because I was on UK time, and the whole thing was like baked in sunlight, and suddenly it all looked really silly. It looked silly and plastic. And my friend said it was a bit like at the end of a nightclub where the lights come on and you realize everything's actually been ugly the whole time, and you just sort of see it. And he's like, that's kind of what Jesus does. You know? He just like turns the light on and shows you that everything was ugly all along. Because I mean, Vegas is one of the most demonic places I've ever been to in my life. But even had so I was there with
there's an emptiness there for sure.
I was there with the guy with there's a show called the Iced Coffee Hour, which I was on, and one of the hosts of that, he was sort of driving me down LA, and we went past what's the pyramid one called? You know, the one that's like Egypt. I forget what the place is actually called. But
I don't know the name of it.
It's got this huge pyramid that shoots this massive beam of light up into the sky, right? And he said, oh, that's really interesting actually, because, you know, Las Vegas often gets these like swarms of locusts. I was like, really? They get swarms of locusts? He was like, yeah. And you know, the crazy thing is, because this pyramid shoots up that massive beam of light, it's amazing. When it happens, they all like swarm onto it.
It's like a tornado.
And start going crazy. And I was like, so you're telling me that swarms of locusts descend on Egypt in Sin City?
Yeah.
It was all getting a little bit biblical.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like that is the perfect place to walk up to somebody and be like, do you think there's something more?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I think that one of the misconceptions about someone who, like me, was a person of faith, of Christian faith, and is no longer a person of Christian faith, or, you know, I've got some faith in things, but not really religious faith, is that somehow the two alternatives are that life of excess and selfishness and like pleasure, or religious faith in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it can throw people off a lot of times when I'm like, oh, I recognize you know, I don't see it as necessarily like, well, one is right and one is wrong, but it's just like, yeah, clearly like a human that is simply focusing on pleasures like that ultimately end up just being, they become empty pretty quickly. Like that's just a universal truth. That's not, like, you as a Christian don't have a universal hold on that truth. That's not just because it was mentioned in the Bible doesn't mean that that's the only place that truth shows up. Like it's a human experience, right? So now, as someone who doesn't really know what I think about God, I still recognize like the emptiness of a place like Las Vegas. But I'm also like, you know what? Maybe every once in a while I want to go experience some excess pleasures.
Yeah. Oh, it was fun.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not judge myself or judge others for it at the same time.
Yeah.
Knowing that if I take the perspective into that, oh, I recognize the emptiness of this. You know, eating at a buffet. I mean, how many times can you eat at a buffet, right?
Yeah.
Before you're like, okay, get me out of the buffets. But I feel like, again, this is kind of the perspective that I think about the way that I thought about those students when I was there with the truth in my hand.
Mm.
You know, I was like, there's two paths here. There's the path that you're on, which is just self-sabotage, or there's Jesus. Never considering that, well, maybe there's a few more ways to think about these things.
Do you think there's pride in there? I mean, one of the worst sins a Christian can commit is the sin of pride. And I think they're constantly sort of battling against it, especially when you're in a position I mean, let alone some of the people I talk to who have public platforms, constantly putting themselves in front of a microphone and answering people's questions and being constantly praised. It must be really difficult to not get prideful when it starts working. But even in an outreach situation like this, is there an element where it's sort of like not like I'm better than these people, but like, look at me doing this good thing, walking into the depths of hell and harrowing it and getting everyone, back to Christ?
Yes. I mean, I think that there's an element of sort of taking pride in the work that you're doing for God, even though you can easily give God the credit, be like, the Spirit was working through me. Because if you know the code of humility, and you know how to talk about these things, but secretly you're thinking about how you're doing in relation to other Christians, and you're thinking about how they're doing in relation to you.
Yeah.
You can't. It's human nature. You're gonna do that. But I think there's another type of pride that I think back on those times. I remember a specific instance, and this is actually after I was no longer on staff with Campus Crusade, but I was still very active in the church, and I was leading a Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
And we had become friends with this couple that were Catholic, and in my estimation, Catholics weren't Christians. I mean, I was that type of evangelical.
Whoa,
yeah.
Really?
I was like, well, maybe there's some that actually have a relationship with Jesus,
Idolaters,
but
worshiping
Mary. They believe,
Yeah.
they believe that it's works and faith. It's not just faith alone,
Sure.
and so they don't have the grace thing figured out. At the very least, I need to introduce them to the real truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew they were going to be there. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do a Bible study. I'm going to go from Galatians, right? Because Galatians talks about that, basically how it's about faith and and not about works. And it was one of those things that, in retrospect, I was thinking about them, and everyone else in the Bible study, the other regulars, knew that I was kind of preaching to them from this perspective. And I think back on that, and I'm like, I brought a lot of spiritual pride to that situation, because I thought I had the correct perspective and just assumed they don't agree with me about this, and they're definitely wrong. I'm bringing them in to give them the truth. When you think that you've got the truth, and it's a truth that impacts everyone, it applies to everyone, it's really difficult to not take pride in that and to begin to see yourself as better. I mean, I'm not saying that all Christians think that they're better than other people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying, for me,
for your experience,
knowing, I remember lying there when I was in college and thinking how grateful I was that I basically believed the right thing about everything.
Yeah, well, I often parody Christian denominations with that exact thought. It's like, what are the odds? How lucky you are.
And with no irony at all.
Yeah.
Of course, I was, a 20-year-old kid, but I was lying there in bed and I was like, man, like, not only am I a Christian, but I am the right kind of Christian. Like, I believe the right stuff. I'm in the right denomination. I'm in the right ministry. Like, even amongst the ministries here on campus, I'm in the one that is the most serious about this.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm so thankful that I'm right about everything, essentially, is what I was saying.
Yeah, those are my nightly affirmations too. I'm just so grateful for being right about everything. It's fascinating. There is an interesting paradox there, the so-called preface paradox, where people can think that they're right about everything whilst also thinking they're wrong about at least one thing. It's called the preface paradox because at the beginning of a book, authors will often say, if there are any mistakes in here, like, I'm sorry. But they've gone through meticulously and checked every single one. So if I went through every single one of your beliefs individually and said, do you think this is true? Yes. Do you think this is true? Yes. Because I'm going through your beliefs. So definitionally, every one of them would say yes. But if at the end I then say, but do you think at least one of those beliefs is actually false? If you're a bit humble in any respect, you go, yeah, of course, one of them's false.
Yeah.
So you've got this paradox of thinking they're all true, but at least one of them's false. It's got to do with like probabilistic certainty, probably. But yeah, there's that feeling that you've got God on your side as well, and you sort of go to sleep slightly prideful, slightly content, slightly happy. Where does that certainty like come from? Was it the result of Bible study and consideration of different groups and denominations? Was it more sociological, just sort of the way you were brought up? Were you cognizant of the factors which led you to be in the correct denomination and the correct student group?
Yeah, so not at the time. I think that what I would have said is that I had been taught the right stuff from my parents,
Mhm.
and I had been in the right environment growing up. I think that ultimately there's a few factors that contributed to it. I think number one, certainty is a really important aspect of religious faith, and especially Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity, because I think that agreeing with a set of propositional statements is actually what if you ask somebody to describe, they might say, well, it's about a relationship with Jesus. But if you're like, well, yeah, but what does that mean?
Mhm.
These propositional statements come up. It's like, well, I believe this about Jesus. If any church worth its salt has a "we believe" place on their website, right?
Mhm.
That's what I thought, right? And so I think that being certain and being right about these things comes at a premium. It is really, really important. So I thought that being certain was very important. And then I just think I had the type of personality, came from the type of family where we kind of thought we had it figured out, right? Like this is a big problem for me now, is to not settle on what I think I figured out, to be really doubtful of my particular perception of the world, to say, well, I know that I'm wrong about some stuff, and there's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure about, but I can struggle with wanting to latch on to certain ideas and be like, well, I've got this figured out, and you start trying to build this worldview. So I think it's a combination of the environment where certainty was really important, and then my personality, the way that I gravitated towards that.
And what was this particular kind of Christianity? You said you were a Protestant. Were you in a particular denomination? Were there particular beliefs that you held that most Protestants would sort of disagree with you about?
What I would say is we called ourselves non-denominational, but from a theological perspective, we would have most aligned with just the Baptist Church.
Sure.
So we were probably a little bit more Reformed Baptist, right? So there was a strong, not as strong as you would have in like a PCA church, a Presbyterian church in America, about predestination.
Mm-hmm.
But, we were kind of soft Calvinists, like 4-point Calvinists, and so we definitely believed that God had predetermined essentially who was his child, which was interesting to do in the context of evangelism.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, how does that affect when you go onto the beach and spring break and you're talking to people? Do you just have this thought like, well, I hope I happen to bump into the people that God's already preordained to come to faith?
Yeah, I think, yes. I think the analogy that I would have used is that I'm planting a bunch of seeds.
Yeah.
And some of them are sort of predetermined to grow and to flourish.
Yeah.
And that's not up to me. I'm just the one that's planting the seeds.
But then if it's not up to you, is it like if you don't plant those seeds, then
they wouldn't get saved?
They wouldn't get saved? I mean, it kind of seems that this whole predestination idea seems to undermine the motivation for going.
This was probably my key, like, theological conundrum in college, because I was close with guys who were Reformed in this way, and were Calvinists, and they would be like, listen, it's just very clear in the scriptures that who he predestines. It's like, and so I remember sitting on the porch one time with my friends as we were talking about that. I said, okay, well, all right, if I want to believe the Bible, and again, I bought into univocality, and I was able to reinterpret the passages that would question this perspective in light of the ones that I had gravitated towards, which is how you build, a systematic theology to begin with. But I remember sitting with them and saying, okay, I can agree that God preordained a certain number of people to be his children, which definitely means that a certain number of people are not predestined to be his children. In fact, statistically speaking, the majority of people who've ever lived and live right now, and they're going to be in hell, So I believe that because the Bible says it. But, and I like paused because I was a little bit nervous. I was like, but doesn't that kind of make God an asshole? And they were like, no. He's just like, you can't understand. First of all, we all deserve to be in hell. The fact that he would save, he's justified in not saving anyone.
Yeah, that's the line, isn't it?
And so then I was like, yeah, but he decided to create a world in which these beings would exist. Like, he still made that choice. Doesn't that still kind of make him an asshole? So I was having thoughts like that at like 20 years old, but was able to continue to carry like a cognitive dissonance that allowed me to still be a very strong Christian and just be like, okay, there are things that I don't understand. God's got that figured out. That'll be the first question I ask him when I get to heaven.
Yeah, and of course there's no Christian who doesn't have thoughts like that swimming around in their minds too. It's, for some people, those are questions that they just retain and, like you say, think, I'll ask God when I see him. Mm-hmm. For others, it's like the first domino falling apart. I'm interested in what your view of hell was at the time when you said that most people are probably going to hell. What did you think hell was at the time when you were around 20?
I had talked myself into, mostly as a result of that struggle I was having, that it was probably some sort of, I basically became, without really reading too much about it, an annihilationist.
Yeah.
And so just the idea that people who don't know God, who are not his children, will probably go through some sort of torment, but it won't be forever, and then they will cease to exist.
Yeah, and that hell is, I mean, annihilationism is the view that people will be annihilated if they don't go to heaven. They sort of cease to exist, maybe after a period of suffering of some sort. Right. I've always been quite attracted to that idea because of the like classical Thomistic arguments for the existence of God, which have God as like the ground of being. Mm-hmm. If God is the foundation of being itself and everything that is participates in him, then if hell is something like separation from God, and if God is the ground of all being, then what does it mean to not be with God? It means to not be. It means to not exist.
Yeah, right.
So I've always thought philosophically there's good grounding for considering separation with God to be the same thing as not existing. Because to exist is to participate in God's existence, as some of the classical philosophers would put it.
Yeah.
But that's not as motivational as the fire and brimstone imagery. And presumably in your outreach, you wouldn't push too heavy on the hell stuff, especially considering that you thought most people were going there anyway and there's nothing they could do about
right. And I think that it's interesting to see. I'm still a fan of Christian apologetics. It's fascinating to me to see the way that, and especially now, I there wasn't nearly as much just apologetics media as there is now when I was deconstructing, because this mostly happened to me in the late aughts and 2010, 2011. And nobody was there were people writing books, but nobody was making internet content about this stuff. But I kind of dip in and dip out, and to see the way the conversation around hell is evolving is fascinating, because it is a really, it's like if you've got, if you're selling a product, it's like the one thing where we get all the bad reviews about this. It's like, oh shit, people keep talking about this one thing, and it's the hell thing. So how do we rebrand hell? And the way that hell is being rebranded is smart. A lot of people are moving into this, annihilationism, but also there are people who just frame it as separation from God. It's just simply like you rejected God's love. Like, that's not hateful for him to say, oh, you just are going to be on your own and whatever that is to deal with your own stuff. And it sounds a lot nicer. It just sounds like you're just rejecting something. And I think that's become a pretty big talking point.
Yeah. What, maybe this was one of them, but when do the dominoes start to fall over for you? How old are you, and what starts to happen? Because right now you're speaking past tense. So at some point you go from not just Christian, but really involved professional Christian, as you put it, to now where you are. Where does this start?
So in my early 20s, the first couple of years out of school, I'm an engineer, civil engineer. I'm still very involved in Campus Crusade at the time. I'm not having that many, existential questions about it. if anything, I'm thinking about how I'm moving towards being a professional Christian, because my wife was still in college at the time. And so Link and I had kind of, we'd been best friends since first grade, 1984. So we kind of knew what we were working towards. And the idea that we were going to develop this ministry where we got to be funny and make our comedy videos. And we were really trying to find a way to do the thing that we loved for the cause that we loved.
So it sort of started as with God in the periphery here, of like with all the video stuff, and it's all sort of directed towards, at least subtly to some degree, evangelism.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was a way to have my cake and eat it too, because I really wanted, like we are entertainers at heart. We wanted to be filmmakers. We wanted to make things that, had significance culturally. We wanted to do that from the very beginning. So we always had our minds of like, on this idea that maybe we'll kind of, we can use this ministry, or we can have a ministry where we're doing these things that we love, and then maybe something that we make will be impactful enough so that we could one day, maybe we'll move to Hollywood and maybe we'll have a ministry there just through the things that we create. That was sort of the thought in the early days. So shortly after the engineering stint, go on staff with Campus Crusade. At that point, you're going to the staff training and you're taking the seminary classes and your initial, and I was always I was not like a super deep student of theology, but I would say moderately deep. And there were certain ideas that I would gravitate towards and things that I like to think about and talk about. At that same time, I was given a book, and I never really thought about the intersection of science and faith. I think the way that I would have described it is, I think that most scientists are not Christians. Most scientists are atheists, and they've come up with some pretty wacky ideas to try to explain the world and why people are the way that they are, why the world is the way that it is. And they're mostly just desperate attempts to explain the world without God's involvement. So that whole thing about evolution and how long the world has been here, that's probably all BS, but I didn't think about it any more deeply than that. I wasn't like a staunch young earth creationist. I didn't think about that issue in particular, but I picked up a book from an astronomer, Hugh Ross, and I'm sure, I've mentioned this before, and he has a Christian ministry that is like very anti-evolution, but very pro old universe from the standpoint of astronomy, which, obviously when you look at all the astronomical evidence and the speed of light and the size of the universe and all this stuff, okay, the universe has been around for probably as long as the scientists are saying. But then he went on to essentially say that, but all truth is God's truth, and this is totally compatible with the Bible. But just so you know, evolution didn't happen. He was a proponent of something called progressive creationism, which essentially was, yes, the world has been around for as long as the scientists say.
Right.
And these fossils we find are legitimate fossils that are approximately the date that they're saying they are. But God was creating new batches of creatures, special creations at different stages throughout the history of the world.
Whoa.
And then ultimately resulting in the creation of people.
So why?
Great question. Great question. So I remember thinking as I'm reading this, I'm like, it's the first time I ever thought about there being some reconciliation between what we observe in science and my belief about the world. And I just remember thinking, this doesn't feel like a good explanation.
I've never heard of somebody. I mean, I'm sure I've met someone who probably like believes that the Earth is old and the universe is old, but maybe is suspicious of evolution. But specifically like, well, I'm a scientist and I'm an astronomer, and there's just no way I can look at the redshifting of the galaxies and deny that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. But that evolution stuff from that other field of biology that I've probably never really seriously studied, that's all BS. And instead, I mean, God is just creating animals willy-nilly.
And there's animals that are getting more and more like a person before the people.
Yeah, it's like God is just sort of doing little trial runs or
Right.
something.
I mean, what does that say about God is what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah, it gets there eventually. That is a little bit strange. I suppose it's kind of biblical in the sense of like stretching out the story of Genesis over however long you needed, and animals sort of popping in on different days and stuff like
Yeah.
this. But yeah, I mean the biggest problem for me that evolution poses to the Christian, and a lot of Christians today just accept evolution. They're like, yeah, sure,
Right.
humans all have a common ancestor with other animals. The biggest problem that I think it poses is the seeming like arbitrariness with which you have to say that, presuming that our apish ancestors don't get to inherit eternal life. At some point, a mother gives birth to a child, and the child is morally condemnable to hell, but also potentially has the ability to inherit eternal life, but his mother doesn't.
Right.
And what the difference is there. And maybe it's just a brute fact. Maybe God just breathed life into that particular organism, but it just seems a bit arbitrary and unfair that person's suffering will now be redeemed and it now means something. But their mothers, who, if the same organism, same suffering, same lifestyle, same everything, dies like an animal, it just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
Unless you want to say that personhood is something which develops as well, but that gets you into a whole lot of trouble with
and so that's where I ended up going, right? Because when I didn't really buy into the progressive creationism thing, but I was so sure that evolution didn't happen. I was like, when you're raised in the Christian faith and the only exposure to the idea of evolution you've ever had has come through the filter of a Christian scientist telling you why it's not legitimate. You know, somebody comes into your church and they're like the evolution expert, and they're like, they make it seem so impossible that you walk out of that with the full affirmation of the idea that evolution definitely didn't happen, and it's a horrible explanation. It will be debunked by the scientists themselves within our lifetime. Like, that's the kind of stuff that we told ourselves, right?
Right.
And we firmly believed it. But because of this proposal, this progressive creationist idea, because the age of the universe and the age of the earth, from a geological, I've always been interested in geology, but from a geological standpoint, I was like, oh, well, this is inescapable. Like, this isn't, like, the way that Answers in Genesis has framed this issue is, I mean, I'm not gonna say it's definitely disingenuous. I think they really just believe that it has to, you know, be consistent with the Bible, and so they're just willing to just completely reshape everything that they're seeing in light of that. But I essentially was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. So then the idea of considering evolution, which just felt, I was like, am I actually about to do this? And I was like, well, I think C.S. Lewis believed in evolution. You know, you start saying these things like, but there's a lot of Christians who are like theistic evolutionists, and okay, so maybe there's something to this. So I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And the thing that I took away from that book was that, well, evolution happened as well. And you know, he touches on it a little bit. He talks about, in that book, I think he talks about the second chromosome, the fusing of the second chromosome. I think he talks a little bit about retroviruses, and essentially, you know, we've got the marks of the same retroviruses on our DNA that chimpanzees do. And there are just these, again, there's no other way to see it.
Just like inexplicable data.
Right. It's like if we're not related to every other animal on Earth, well, God certainly tried to make it seem like we are.
Yeah.
And so then that was a huge moment for me. I remember coming home, still living in North Carolina. Again, a lot of people think that the story that is often told is that Link and I were Christians. We came to Los Angeles. We were corrupted by this sinful city, and we threw away our faith. And the reality, and I've told it many times, but you know, it's passed over, is that all this happened when I was in North Carolina.
Right.
This happened when I was completely buckled into the Bible Belt as tightly as you can be, surrounded by people who agree with me about all these things, with no social pressure to deviate from that at all. In fact, a lot of social pressure to stay in the fold.
opposite.
So I was struggling a lot because I didn't have anybody to talk to about this.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Link. I talked to Link about it a little bit, and he would just kind of be like, "Oh shit!" Like that. It felt like you're learning a lot of things that seem problematic, but I'm not going to think of. I don't want to think about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jessie, my wife, who did come from like a young Earth creationist background, like that's that's what she was taught growing up. When I came home and I was like, "We need to talk about something," and I said, I am thoroughly convinced that evolution is true and that we are related to every other animal. I believe in common ancestry. And I just think that it is not just, I sort of think it's true. It's just like my reading has led me to think that if this isn't true, then I actually can't determine what anything that's true. It's so overwhelming. Because I'd read additionally to that. She just starts crying. Because she knew what this represented.
Right.
This was this seismic shift. And I think a lot of people that I tell this story to are like, what do you mean? But there's all these Christians that believe in evolution. Like, I can't believe that this was so significant for you. But I think the reason it was is because at that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might be wrong about something so fundamental. And then, not only was I wrong, but all of these Christian apologists who were so sure about their critiques of evolution, they had missed the boat so significantly on this that suddenly I was like, can I trust anything else they've got to say about this? So that was the first big domino.
Yeah. It's significant, like you say. I mean, you might think, well, there are Christians who believe in evolution, but it depends which way you come at it. I mean, if you're somebody who's like a scientifically minded person who comes to faith in Jesus, you're not going to abandon evolution, but you might think, okay, I can make this all work. But if you've come from the background you've come from, it's like going up to your wife and saying, I just think maybe we should like live in separate houses or something. And your wife starts bawling, and someone says, "Hey, I don't really know. Some people do that. Some married couples, they live apart." And stuff. It's like, yeah, but what it represents to move from where we are now and the way we were living to having this kind of question or this kind of desire indicates a direction of thought.
Yeah,
which you don't really want to entertain. Your wife, if I'm not mistaken, was a student of Bart Ehrman. At Chapel Hill.
She was.
Right? And was this around this kind of time? Was she already being fed the atheist lies through her professor?
So when this was undergrad, right. at UNC. And she, at that point, this was before we even went on staff with Campus Crusade. I mean, there was no questioning of anything. Like we both saw Bart as the enemy, right? This guy is coming and he's just decimating the faith of Christian students.
Yeah.
And
with a laugh,
Yeah.
He comes in with that chuckle that
so disarming. And it's funny. I haven't met Bart. I want to because I want to be able to tell him this story. Well, the first thing that would happen is Jessie. My wife is she's very passionate and she's very smart. Mm-hmm. And so she was a great defender of the faith when she was in it. Mm. And she would challenge him, right? And she would like go up to him after class and be like, what about this or what about that? And then she would like come and report back or like, this is what he said. And, and I'm sure that there are many students who have continued to attempt this strategy with him over the years. At the same time, there was somebody who was working with Campus Crusade at UNC who approached a couple years later when Link and I were already beginning to do our ministry work, who approached me and Link and said, we actually want to create some resources to counter what Bart is doing on campus, because we feel like we need to equip students better because they're going into these classes of his and having being confronted with these questions. And what can we do, like in terms of a multimedia project to address that? So we were actually beginning to have those conversations. It never became anything. I mean, how ironic would it be if I could dig up a video of me like criticizing Bart from 20 years ago. I kind of wish we had done it
would be cool.
just so I'd have it now.
That would be awesome.
But yeah, so there was never, I think that there was, especially in those days, in the college days, there was zero curiosity
Right.
about whether or not I might be wrong.
Yeah.
You know, that wasn't even up for debate. There was full confidence and no curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And I am in a very, a very different place. I think those two things have reversed at this point in my life.
Right.
Very low
That's the best way
confidence
to
in
be.
my perspective and high curiosity for all of this stuff.
Yeah, I feel like that's been happening to me over the past few years as well, and I think it's for the better. It's less entertaining and it's less fulfilling on a superficial level, because it's nice to be able to, even when you're just talking to somebody, it's nice to be able to, at dinner, when somebody asks you and you think, right, here it is, I'll lay it out, here's my beliefs and here's why I think this, and let's have a discussion about it. It's less fulfilling to sort of go, you know what, man, I've got kind of no idea, but here are some thoughts. But I think it protects yourself against the kind of spiritual crisis which you inevitably run up against when that first domino starts to fall. And for you, it was evolution. You've said before that you used to kind of evangelize against evolution without having known very much about evolution. I mean, it sounds like the moment you started like reading into evolution of its own accord, you became convinced by it. How do you navigate arguing against evolution if you haven't already engaged with that primary literature? Like, I'm really intrigued when I heard you say that on some other show or something. It's like, well, I hadn't really learned about evolution, but I used to go out and argue against it. Like, what arguments are you using? Like, how do you do
Great
that?
question. First of all, it was a different time.
Yeah.
Anyone who's interested in these issues now can get, I mean, you could just ask ChatGPT to give you a primer on evolution. But all I had was, I mean, there was a few books, but one I remember, there was this, I can't remember the author's name, but the title was Icons of Evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of talks about the quote unquote best arguments for evolution, and he talks about why they're all corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I found is that, first of all, 99% of the people that I engage with about this, where I was from and at the time, knew nothing about evolution. Even if they were like, yeah, I agree with that because that's what the scientists say.
Yeah.
But then you're like, describe the mechanism of evolution.
It's like, we come from monkeys, right?
Well, I had read enough to say things like, okay, so you're saying that the primary raw material of evolution and through natural selection are genetic mutations. So give me an example of a beneficial mutation.
Mm.
And at best, your beneficial mutation just causes a change in color. But give me an example of a new species.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
That stare is quite
right.
It's quite intimidating. Suddenly I'm like, I'm thinking, is evolution true? I don't know.
Right.
Man, I don't know, man.
And so I just had those back pocket, and then I would say things like, take for instance, if we took all you have this concept that you put organisms into different environments and they suddenly become, they adapt to different environments.
Mm-hmm.
But what if we were to take all of the dogs in the world and put them out into the wild? What would happen? We would have a convergence to a type of canine that could survive in the wild. Mm-hmm. And it wouldn't be my little poodle, and it wouldn't be the Great Dane. It wouldn't be these extravagant dogs that we have created through artificial selection. Mm. It would be the one that adapts to the environment, and that would probably look like a wolf.
Mm-hmm.
End of story.
Mm.
Evolution doesn't happen. And most people who don't know anything about it are like, oh, okay, I guess it doesn't happen.
Yeah. It's easy enough to do when somebody really, really just doesn't know. Because I think most people are at that position where they kind of know that evolution is this thing and it's got something to do with genetics and environment selection, but all you need is like one good counterexample or question that can't be answered, along with that confidence.
Yeah.
And those eyebrows.
Yeah, the eyebrows are key.
The eyebrows and the confidence, and there's something about the fact that you're doing this kind of professionally as well. Like if they know, oh, this is the guy who's part of this organization and whatnot, they're probably thinking, even if I had an answer, he'll have heard it because he does this every day.
Right,
and so like there's just something about that confidence which is going to be quite off-putting for people. But presumably those questions start to get answered for you by the reading that you're doing. And Was it, I mean, you said it was Francis Collins' book. Is there a moment where you're reading it and like your mind goes to those apologetical arguments that you make and you're like, oh, that doesn't work anymore.
I'm like, this, there's not an explanation for this. And of course, you can do that. You can, every single one of these things, there's a page on the Answers in Genesis website for everything that we could talk about related to evolution. So they've got their perspective on the second chromosome and the fusing of that chromosome. Yeah. They've got their perspective on these retroviruses. And I think I was getting to a place where I no longer, I would essentially, I read their responses and I was just like, this can't be right. Like they have to be wrong about this. Like this is not a good faith argument. This is not a good faith answer, And that's when it started dawning on me that, okay, I began to notice a pattern, and I think maybe I didn't even realize I was noticing a pattern yet, but this is the pattern that started then and then propagated itself throughout my entire deconstruction. And that is, there's a type of answer that someone gives when their allegiance is to the truth that they need to be true. And there's a type of answer that people who are actually interested in the truth give. And what I kept finding is that Christian apologetics, really consists of people who are like, well, the truth cannot be questioned. The truth, we've predetermined that this is true. And now we've got to find a way to buttress that truth. And there's a tenor to those arguments that they don't hold up very well under scrutiny. When you get the answer to the answer to the answer to the answer, you just keep finding it. Like, it just seems like these people seem to be interested in what actually happened, and these people seem to be interested in the truth that they hope that happened. And that was a huge flip for me because again, as a Christian, what I thought is we have the truth, they have the desperate attempt to be anti-God, right? We were taught that these evolutionists, these professors who are teaching this kind of stuff, like they're sinful, they're deceived. They desperately don't want God to exist. So therefore they got to come up with these ideas in order to explain them away. But when you're like, actually, first of all, most of these ideas came from Christians. The age of the earth, these geologists back in the day, these were just most people were Christians. It's just the fact of the matter. And they were like, oh, God must have done it in this way.
Yeah.
And then when they find evolution, okay, God must have done it in this way. And so the scientific stuff, there were plenty of people who taught me like, it's okay, you can believe that. You can be a theistic evolutionist. You probably still need to believe in a literal Adam and Eve because the atonement still needs to make sense. Original sin's got to make sense. And I was like, okay, yeah, those arguments seem like we're just trying to marry two disparate ideas.
Yeah.
But I was like, okay. But I just think that mentality of finding that the people, because it got into biblical scholarship after that. It got into, okay, well, the primeval history, so this is allegory? Like this didn't happen? These are religious myths that were adapted from other myths that were around at the same time. The flood didn't happen.
Yeah.
The Tower of Babel is a weird explanation for language. I started seeing all that, and so I was like, okay, now my entire view of the beginning of the Bible is different. And again, I would go to the apologetics answer, and I would be like, one person seems to be, like the critical scholars actually seem to be like interested in what happened. Like, why did these people write this? Why is it like this? Where did this idea come from? And then the Christian apologists seem to be like, well, we know it's God's word, so how do we prove it? And it just kept creeping closer and closer to Jesus. And I had this this happened, this was years, right? Because I was like, well, I'm not going to stop believing in Jesus. You can have these weird ideas about the Old Testament, but like Jesus is different. I mean, I have a personal relationship with him, and and that stuff's true, right? the stuff about the resurrection, my arguments for why the resurrection had happened, and it being the best explanation for the beginning of the church and all this. I had those arguments in my back pocket. But long story short, eventually those arguments fell victim to the same type of critique. They're a little bit different because I do think that there is a more interesting conversation around the resurrection because you can kind of know a little bit less about what happened. And you can be somebody who believes all this stuff about that I might agree with related to evolution, but then be like, I have a faith position that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I recognize that it's not a scientific thing. I can't prove it. It is a little bit different category. But it opened me up to questioning these sacred ideas. And it's just the most sacred idea of all that Jesus was the Son of God who raised from the dead, eventually was the last domino to fall.
Wow. And how does that finally fall? I mean, because the evolution thing confronts, and I think the reason why it was so scandalous in the 19th century is kind of just a vibe shift, right? Because when you speak to philosophically minded Christians, they will quite correctly say, there is no argumentative syllogism you can construct which shows that because animals have a common ancestor, therefore God doesn't exist. That doesn't follow. There's no argument you can make from that. But it's hard to put into words just like the feeling. Again, it's like we were saying before about the indicating a direction of thought. When a society is based upon the idea that human beings are special and unique.
Yeah.
This idea, if you're smart, it doesn't need to undermine the idea that God exists, but it shows this direction of thought, like, oh gosh, we're not as special as we thought we were, and where's that going to lead? I'm pretty sure that in the first edition of The Origin of Species in 1859, that beautiful ending, there is grandeur in this view of life from many different species, whatever it is, having been breathed into many lives or into one, have been and are being evolved. And there's that phrase, like having been breathed into one or to many, primordial forms of life. And presumably because of the backlash that this idea receives in the second edition of The Origin of Species, having been breathed by the Creator into one life or to many, Darwin defaced the ending, his moving ending to The Origin of Species. And I think by edition 3, it was back out again. So you can, I've seen one in person, an actual second edition at like a rare bookshop. If you happen to be in like a fancy rare bookshop and see if they've got a second edition, it will say by the Creator, because there's just something so confronting about it that you need to respond to. But okay, there's that. And then there's the resurrection. That's not just like a vibe shift. This is the historical claim upon which Christianity is based. And like you say, it's less accessible to the scientific method because it's a singular event.
Yeah.
It's not like a process that's still going on today that we can biologically observe. And you can't scientifically or historically prove the resurrection, but you can prove like surrounding facts.
Yep.
You can say that Jesus was crucified, that his disciples claimed to see him, all of this kind of stuff. All of those arguments are still there and still sat in your mind. Presumably you're pretty familiar with them as someone who specializes in outreach. Why would that change? Like what shifts the dial on those kinds of arguments for you?
And this is where I don't remember specifically like, okay, well, it was this book, it was that, but it could be something as simple. It was one aspect of that argument, of that case. Probably the most famous one is, well, why would the disciples die for a lie?
Mm-hmm.
And then when I really looked into that, and then I found that, well, I don't think I can actually historically defend that anyone died for something that they knew to be a lie. Like, I think that this can be explained by them being deceived, right? They could just be wrong about what they saw or their perspective. But I think the bigger picture was, as I started looking at different perspectives on the historical Jesus, I remember there was one book that was called The Historical Jesus, 5 Views. And I read that book, and I think every one of them was some kind of Christian.
Yeah,
just
sure.
Different gradations of liberal or progressive Christian. And everyone laid out their case with a lot of confidence and a lot more scholarship and knowledge than I have about the subject. But it was so gray. And I just started, this feeling began to creep in, which was like, okay, well, maybe he did rise from the dead, but what I've learned about the process of historical investigation, and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like, it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know the nature of specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into a large, like mass grave? Was he put into a rich man's grave by Joseph of Arimathea? Was that invented? I don't know. But what seems to be pretty clear to me is that it's almost certain that there's some explanation for how it all started that isn't that he actually raised from the dead. In my compulsion to believe that he raised from the dead, it is a religious position. It is a faith position. It's not an historically defensible position to the degree that these Christian apologists make it out to be. We were talking last night about Dale Allison, how I just think I love his book.
He's great.
And this was all like, I read that like 2 years ago. So this is all way after my deconstruction, but I'm still interested in the subject. But, he's a Christian. He believes that it happened. But I think he's got one of the best books on the resurrection. The thing is so refreshing about it is he's not coming at this from like a Gary Habermas standpoint where he's like, this is the most reasonable thing. And if you don't agree with that, you're being unreasonable. It's like, well, no, we're talking about the pinnacle of an unreasonable idea, an unreasonable event. This is not... If this happened, this is something I have to accept on faith, and I am completely fine with people who do that. But my intuition is that it didn't happen, and I have sort of lost my ability to have faith in things that are just conjecture and things that something that foundational. I mean, I still have what I would call some level of religious faith. We can talk about what that might look like, but I think that my ability to have faith in the idea of the resurrection, it just was like, why would you choose for that to be the thing that you believed in when all these other things have sort of fallen apart to this process?
Came across an interesting idea. A friend told me, I wish I could remember exactly how this goes, but I'm pretty sure that there is a development as the Gospels go on about the description of the tomb. So like, in Mark's gospel, presumably, I think it just says that Jesus is put in a tomb. And in Matthew's gospel, it becomes a new tomb. And then I think by Luke, it's a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Or maybe that's John. I can't remember the details, but there's things that you wouldn't notice that I'd never come across this idea before. If the empty tomb is an important apologetic to Jesus' resurrection, well, we know that the tomb was empty. In order to know that the tomb was empty, you need to ensure that Jesus was probably the only person laid in it, because otherwise it could have been mixed up with someone else or something like this. And so there is this hint at evidence of an early apologetical motive to make the tomb a new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in there, and then specifically a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Right. So that when they say there's an empty tomb, nobody can come along and say, well, are you sure it wasn't somebody else, or someone stole the body, or it got lost or something? No, it has to be an empty tomb. And so you're right that when those little questions, well, are we sure that he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb in the way that it's described? And if you start to notice apologetical motivations potentially in those very stories, it starts to undermine the historicity a little bit. Like how Matthew's gospel is the only one that mentions the guards at the tomb. Right. And we're told why the guards, like we're told by Matthew essentially why he's included the story of the guards, because they are like, Jesus is gone, and the Jews pay the guards and say, you're going to spread the rumor that the body got stolen. That's what you're going to do. And the guards are like, sure thing, we'll do that. We'll take that money. And this is a rumor that still persists to this day, says Matthew's gospel.
And what's the best explanation for that?
Is it like there were actually guards and Matthew is the only person who happened to report them? Or has Matthew invented the guards as an apologetical tool, admitting that there is this rumor that the body was stolen, and thereby having to invent the guards at the tomb to protect against that. Maybe there were guards. Like, we can't prove that there weren't. But when you start to see how much potential apologetical motivation is underlying these claims in these gospels, which, although broadly seeming to be attempts at historical biography, are also just full of what is probably best thought of as mythical storytelling, becomes really difficult. Dale Allison talks at length about the raising of the graves in Matthew's gospel at the time of Jesus'
which
death.
is bonkers.
It's absolutely bonkers. But it's really strange how it's worded as well, because it says that when Jesus dies, it says at that moment when he dies, there's a great earthquake and all the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem appear to people after the resurrection. And it's a really weird, clunky wording, because it says that the graves opened when Jesus died, but then it said that the people appeared to many after the resurrection, as if like they were just laying dead in the open tomb for 3 days or something. Like, it's weirdly worded, and you've got this, and Matthew's the only one who reports it, and you've got this undertone of Jesus being the firstborn of the dead, and it's like, okay, like Dale Allison is pretty convinced this didn't actually happen. It's another question whether Matthew thought it happened,
Right.
But the problem is that if Matthew didn't, this is just a bit of myth that Matthew is obviously telling some kind of allegorical story. What does that mean? It means that Matthew is willing to make up stories about resurrecting people from the dead in order to serve a theological
If it happened
point.
once.
And then the floodgates are open, especially because Matthew's gospel is the earliest gospel that has any post-resurrection appearances recorded in it. Boom, the doors are open.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's so fascinating to me about this is, famously, evangelical Christians, especially when I was coming up in campus ministry, like, we had our anti-Mormon arguments.
Oh yeah.
Right. There was this one summer that some Mormon missionaries, like, I was out of the country doing some missionary work, and Link was still in Raleigh, and there were Mormon missionaries that came to talk to him. They ended up coming back like 4 or 5 times because Link, at that time, especially at the time, wasn't controversial, it wasn't confrontational. He was just like, yeah, you guys. So they went through the whole spiel or whatever. And then when I got back, I was like, you let them come like 5 times? You didn't never challenge them? And he was like, well, I was just kind of waiting. I ended up writing this like pamphlet. I would do this all the time. I would write like little papers or pamphlets or whatever. And there was one that was like, this is what you need to say the next time the Mormons come to your door, right? Because you can take apart their theology and their history in a much, it's so recent, right? So that was my perspective. And I find it so interesting that the average Christian apologist, the level of scrutiny they apply to criticizing Mormonism, if they would just for a moment turn that level of scrutiny on their own story, you'd be like, guys, come on, do you see what you're doing? Or like, and if you had been born in a Muslim country and you were of the Muslim faith and you didn't believe that Jesus actually raised from the dead, what would your Muslim apologetic about the resurrection be? Like, do you really think these arguments are as strong, or is it just you need them to be true?
Yeah.
It's so foundational to who you are, you need this to be true. But the second aspect of it is, it's like, we're sitting here having this conversation in the context of 2025, where we have access to all this scholarship. And all this scholarship and all these discussions about these issues are such a recent phenomenon that, first of all, the tiny minority of people who live today, who call themselves Christians, care about this stuff and actually take time to think about it, right? You believe that Jesus rose from the dead if you're a Christian, probably because your parents told you, like 90% because your parents told you. And then you got into a movement where it's continually confirmed by people who come in and they say some smart stuff about it, and this is why you can trust it. So even if it did happen, it doesn't feel like a really penetrating investigation into the historical circumstances is what's going to make it click and be like, oh, it did happen. I looked under the last rock of history and I found the resurrection. Like, it doesn't seem like God intended for that to be the way. If
that's right.
This is clearly this is a revelation. This is like, this is a secret. This is like God's secret information that you can choose to believe. And then your life is transformed. Like, I'm okay with people who frame it in that way. I'm like, well, I still think that I think this is a psychological phenomenon. I don't believe it. I'm a skeptic in that regard, but I just find it so interesting the way that some of these apologists go so hard on trying to prove it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, do you really think that that's gonna be the thing that changes somebody's mind?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's what Jesus was doing.
No,
Verily I say unto you, premise one.
Yeah, he wasn't doing apologetics.
It doesn't work like that. It's clearly like not what it's all about.
Right.
And apologetics can only take you so far. I mean, there is this idea online in particular that to be a Christian or to be religious is to essentially do natural theology, is what they call it, which is like arguing for the existence of God. Like the whole religion discussion has become consumed with God's existence, biblical scholarship, and we forget that it's actually an assumption and a controversial assumption that is the approach to have to this conversation. For many people, like natural theology is just a waste of time and an improper approach to the question of God's existence. And most people who have a religious experience will report that. Thomas Aquinas famously didn't finish the Summa Theologica, the greatest Christian metaphysician of all time. And he doesn't finish it because he's performing Mass, he's performing the Eucharist, and he has a religious experience.
Right.
And his like friend or colleague or whatever is like writing to him, begging him, you have to finish this, Thomas. Like this is, you've got to finish. And he says, I can write no more. It's all straw compared to what I've seen. And you're right about the double standard as well. I just had a Mormon on my show, Jacob Hansen, who one of the key things that he likes to emphasize, he doesn't usually speak to atheists. This is quite funny. I saw him recently and he says he doesn't usually speak to atheists because there are so many like metaphysical assumptions you have to make. If you want to talk about Mormonism, you already sound absolutely mental. If you're talking to someone who doesn't even already believe in like angels and God and stuff, you're not going to move an inch. But he's like, I always talk to Christians because they do believe in angels and revelation and prophets and all this kind of stuff. And he can kind of like hold up a mirror to these Christians because they look at him and be like, oh yeah, so like, you know, God spoke to some dude in upstate New York through some like golden plates that like no one's ever seen, you know, and he's like, yeah, well, how many witnesses do you have to the resurrection that left any accounts?
Right.
Like, we've got more eyewitness testimony to the golden plates than you've got to the resurrection, you know? And it's this like, obviously I can look at this and think both of them are, you know, not quite hitting the mark.
Right.
But his big gripe is like, I don't mind people saying that we don't have enough evidence or you're not convinced or whatever, but as a Christian, you can't switch that off when it comes to analyzing your own faith. And it does sound absurd to be like, oh, there was a prophet in New York, was there? But we've only just got used to the idea that religion comes from, you know, that it comes from the Middle East. The whole reason why Jesus is born of Nazareth is like a lowly origin. They even say in the Gospels, you know, is he the guy from Nazareth? You know, what good comes from Nazareth? We're just used to it now. But at the time, that would have sounded about as crackpot as saying, you know, this guy in upstate New York, yeah, he's found some golden plates and they're buried under the ground. And so I do find like, I've talked about Mormonism a lot recently because I do find it holds up this interesting mirror to Christian apologetics. It's like, this is kind of how you sound, guys, a lot of the time.
Yeah, I certainly agree. It is this, and to have been on that side of it and to, I mean, I specifically, I don't still have that document that I wrote, the guide to talking to your Mormon friends. That is a shame.
Friends. I was going to ask.
I mean, it might be in some, you know, box somewhere. But I can tell you that it was incredibly dismissive. And I think that I was trying to be cute and funny at the same time. And so I'm sure I was like essentially saying, can you believe that people believe this? Like, if you only knew how crazy this set of beliefs was, you would basically deny it on that, the fact of how crazy it was. But it's like, it's not any crazier. It's just less familiar. You know, it's just less familiar than these things that we believe so wholeheartedly. Yeah, but at the time, I mean, you can't see it. When you're in it, you can't see it.
Yeah, of course. You said at the time you said you started believing in natural selection and your wife's in tears. Does that like put you off? Do you think, oh gosh, maybe I shouldn't dig any further? Is it already an unstoppable force? Like, how does that go? Because presumably she's kind of okay with the evolution thing now. So
she's more than okay with it at this point.
Like how does that like begin to develop? Do you just kind of keep going and say like, sorry, darling, but this is what I think, and there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah, it moved very slow because, again, I didn't have all these YouTubers talking about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I had to make the decision to be like, I'm going to buy this book and take the time to read it. And I'm still like living my life. I'm not like a voracious reader. I mean, I read quite a bit, but it's pretty slow.
Mm-hmm.
And Link and I are trying to build a career, and we're trying to like make ends meet. And this is early days of YouTube. So I was a bit scared of where this might lead. And I think I just had this idea, because again, where we come from, everyone else in our families are not just Christians, but they're strong, committed Christians. This is the most important thing in their life. We grew up looking down on cultural Christians. We could spot them. Now, that person just goes to church because it's the thing to do. But we go to church because this is the most important thing that we could do, is having communion with other believers. And so I think that it moved very slowly because of that. I was getting into the historical Jesus stuff in like 2010. I like looking back at some of my journal entries, and that was when it was beginning to kind of fall apart. Like the Jesus part was falling apart. But we moved to LA in 2011. So one of the things that happened, Link and I had a series where we were making these local commercials. Several of them had gone viral in like the late aughts. And we ended up getting a TV show on IFC. That's why we moved out here. So we moved out here with our wives and kids all together in 2011. And I kind of thought to myself, this is maybe an opportunity to start over a little bit. We went to a church that we had some friends at that we knew from out here. And it was in Hollywood, and it was like the music was awesome, and everyone was so cool, and they wore like the cool hats. It was like hipster church, and it was so much different than what I came from.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they talked about these issues it was just more nuanced and gray. And I found myself thinking like, I think I could do this.
Mm-hmm.
I think I could do this because, I guess ultimately if you backed this person into a corner, the pastor would probably believe all the stuff that I believe, but he's holding it a little bit more loosely. And maybe I can kind of have this thing like, I love Jesus. And I remember writing in my journal, when Peter talks about, when Jesus is asking him if he's going to leave, and he's like, well, where else would I go?
Yeah.
I thought the same thing. I was like, what am I going to do? Become an atheist? Become non-religious? Become a different religion? It's just like, even if I'm not sure about this, I'm sure that Jesus is good for me.
Yeah.
I'm sure that these ideas are good for me, and this idea of believing in resurrection and like this, I can kind of just maintain this. That's where I was when I moved out here. That lasted such a short period of time because when I would stop and I would just think about it, I'd be like, yeah, but it's probably not true. And I started finding people who had been through similar things I could talk to about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And you start just finding there's people who have, and also I started finding people, I can't remember exactly, they weren't really talking about on YouTube, but there were people writing about it, blogs and that kind of thing. And you just start finding, oh, these people don't believe this anymore, but they're still good people who want the same thing out of life. Because my wife and I thought our marriage would end. We thought we wouldn't have anything useful to share with our children. When you believe this idea that you've got the truth and that this is the most essential truth, and it isn't just about your salvation, it's about your life. Like your marriage is based on this commitment to Christ first.
Yeah.
Your kids and every decision that you make about them is based on this biblical understanding and this framework. You're going to throw that out. What are you going to do? What's going to happen to your marriage? What's going to happen to your kids? But then you start finding all these people who don't know what they think about it anymore, and they like still have solid marriages, and their kids are still good kids who are just trying the best that they can. And so I think that about 1 or 2 years into being out here, when I was kind of like, okay, I don't I just don't believe this at all. I'm not going to call myself a Christian. But maybe we'll keep going to church for a while while I try to figure out what we're going to do about the kids.
Yeah. Did that have anything to do with like LA and the demons of the city? Or do you think it was just like already, if you'd have stayed in North Carolina, the same thing would have happened?
I think that LA gave me the permission to basically be like, because if I was back home and my decision to not go to church back home would have involved several discussions with family.
Yeah.
Whereas my decision to not go to church in LA was just my decision to not go to church.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt. So that's what I'll give the Christian critics, is that the role that LA played is it did give me the freedom.
Sure.
Because we're not in a culturally Christian environment out here in the same way. It's like people believe all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so my decision to be like, okay, well, we're just not going to be a part of this anymore.
Yeah.
Was made easier.
Yeah. And by that time, is your wife still in tears about it? Like, how does that progression?
By that time, I think the thing with her, we are in basically exactly the same place now in terms of like what she would, she believes essentially the same thing, and it took her own path to that and has her own perspective, and the things that are important or interesting to me are not necessarily important or interesting to her.
It's like a reverse Lee Strobel, isn't it?
Yeah.
The case against Christ,
right?
The movie.
Yeah, and so she's basically in the same place. Doesn't consider herself a Christian, but I think for her as a mom who is homeschooling, I think there was this. Well, what do we do? Like, what do we do about our kids? I feel like I need to continue to teach some of these ideas to them, and there needs to be some kind of framework. And this is something that a lot of people who are deconstructing deal with, because religion works. I definitely believe that we created it, but we created it because we needed it to some degree for the ritual, the community, the sense of awe, these things that are essential to the human experience that I do think you can experience outside of a religious community. But for most of history, religious communities have done that best. And when you have kids and you're raising a family and you're looking for purpose and meaning and structure, you can choose to like hodgepodge create that on your own, or you can plug into a community that has a set of shared myths. And that's a really difficult thing to navigate. But it's been a long process, but we found people who were also navigating it, found our own community, and I think that was a big part of our sort of moving out of it.
Yeah. So now, what's your relationship to Christianity like? I mean, you said you read Dale Allison's book like 2 years ago. That's no like, easy bedtime reading. You've got to still have some kind of interest in the resurrection to do that. Like, are you still reading about it? Are you still intrigued? I mean, what do you see as your relationship with Christianity now?
There's a fascination with it that I just think is just a natural inclination. I think that part of it, an analogy I've used before is, if I had been raised in a religion that was based on the Lord of the Rings books, I think that I would have been shaped significantly by those books, that worldview, that even if I left it, I think there's this like, it's such a part of who I am. I think going back and reading them and experiencing them would be something that was a little bit comfortable, but also helps to kind of like, it helps me understand the way that I am. I am the way that I am. I see the world the way that I see the world because of my background. I may not completely agree with all of it anymore. I disagree with most of it, but I would be lying if I didn't say it was an essential part of who I am. So I think that there's always going to be this fascination with Jesus, and I almost feel this compulsion to defend the person of Jesus from the way he is used, especially in America.
Yeah.
In American politics, especially.
Yeah.
That's been a fascinating, the rise of Christian nationalism has been a fascinating thing for me to watch.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know exactly what I would have done if I would have stayed in the faith, but I'm pretty certain that I wouldn't have gotten on the Trump train, just from a Christian standpoint. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that to see the way that the name of Jesus is used, and the way and the ideas that he is being used to support, that it's super fascinating. But I also find this need to be like, yeah, but what was he about? Like, I don't know what the man who lived, that I do believe lived, I don't know what he actually said. I don't know like what's the percentage of the record that we have. But whatever, we have this movement that was started and they wrote these things, and like some of these ideas are really beautiful, you know, like from a moral standpoint, like the things that Jesus asked you to do, being selfless, being service oriented, you know, caring about the poor and the needy, not just being about your own accumulation of your possessions, recognizing the emptiness in the accumulation of possessions. Like, these are beautiful ideas that I subscribe to today. So I think part of my interest is this, like, I want to rescue Jesus from the hands of the people who are using him for evil. Yeah,
because they're pretty out of line. I mean, Jesus says this, doesn't he? You know, there'll be people who come to me saying, "Lord, Lord," and I'll say, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And there is an idea that the path is narrow, and it does just seem at times flatly contradictory, the attitudes that people have. And yet, I don't know if it's like a biblical literacy thing or what, but when you see like prosperity preachers, for example, flying around in private jets and things, and you think, I don't know how you can read the Gospels and not have this just jump off the page at you. Have you seen the clip of Donald Trump asked what his favorite Bible verse is? I think this is 2016 election
I'd rather
cycle.
not get into this specifics.
It's sort of very personal, and they're like, really, anything jump out? She's like, no, I think it's too personal. And they say, are you more of a Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy? And he goes, I would say probably equal. Equal.
Yeah.
You know, and by the way, I think by the next time he's asked, you know, what your favorite Bible verse is, he's like, oh, it's, you know, 2 Corinthians 1:7.
Right,
like
right.
He's got the.
Well, this is the interesting thing about that. Because I want to give, like, first of all, there are many Christians who are just like buying this idea that like that Trump's actually a Christian, right? That is happening. But I will give, there's a lot of Christians, I'll give them credit. They don't for a second. They don't for a second buy that he's a Christian. They know that he's using the Christians for his ends. But, and I know many people like this, but they believe that the things that he's a crude tool to basically accomplish things that are more consistent with the Christian worldview.
Yes.
And so it's a little more nuanced. And so I understand that that's what they think, but then I'm like, yeah, but okay, let's talk about the things that platform wants to establish that are still very inconsistent with the bulk of the things that Jesus talked about.
Then one wonders how much that is Christian nationalism as a whole, how much of it is really Christian outside of just being nominally Christian in the way that Trump might be nominally Christian. I mean, the one thing that gives me pause for thought is like when he was nearly assassinated, he did sort of quite convincingly portray a feeling of sort of spiritual awakening after that. I mean, he put it in quite uncomfortable terms about like, you know, well, if you look at that, if you look at how close it was, I saw the graphic of how it went just past my head. If you look at that and you're an atheist, you know, you got to start rethinking it. And there is this forgetting of Corey Comparatore, who's the firefighter that the bullet eventually went into and killed.
Right.
But I did think, if you were nearly assassinated, especially if you've already got this sort of egomania around you, president of the United States type thing, to have your head turn at the right moment and avoid assassination, I do wonder if maybe that did make him at the very least like seriously consider the possibility of divine watching.
Right.
But I don't know even then, although I want to grant him that possible space for spiritual growth, I don't know if that develops into like, you know, it's easier for a rich man to for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle and all of that kind of stuff. But and so it's like it's a crude tool as you put it. And if you just look at the way that one does wonder. I always thought of doing like skits where you sort of put Jesus in the modern day and see how he would actually react, like the sort of this strange juxtaposition of the Christian attitude you're supposed to have and what Jesus was actually all about. Because some of his teachings I do think are difficult and maybe inapplicable. I had this idea of him like walking through central London or something, and somebody like comes up to him, says, "Sorry, have you got any change?" And the disciples would go, "Sorry, mate, we haven't got any change." And he goes, "Yeah, brethren, when one is in need, if you do this to the least of these, you do it to me." So it's like, Matthew, grab the purse and give them some money. Anyway, as I was saying, and then another person comes up, "Have you got any change, mate?" And they're like, "Oh, we just get it." And he's like, "Because one person is in need, because you've helped one, does that lessen the need to help another? No. Peter, grab your tunic. We're going to give it to him, And then and people just keep sort of coming up, and at the end, someone comes up. "You got any change?" And Jesus is like, "Sorry, mate, I haven't got any change." Because I do wonder, how directly applicable some of these teachings are to the modern world. And so it's kind of easy to say, Christian nationalism isn't Christian. Jesus would never abide by Trump. But it's difficult to imagine what Jesus would say about the presidency of a transcontinental republic in general anyway, right? So I always find it very difficult to make those kinds of claims.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons that I think this is, back to the idea of like, why is it so fascinating?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you really appreciate the context for what this person was operating in, and you think about that for every scripture, the idea that like, oh, this makes so much more sense, not as some prophecy for current times, but it was a rhetorical exercise for what they were dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the Bible actually becomes more meaningful in one sense, maybe not in like a ultimate meaning way, but in the way that we actually find and build meaning as humans based on how we interact with our circumstances and how our values interact with our circumstances. Like that's what these biblical writers were doing all along.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it kind of comes alive to me. Like I always thought, I don't understand these biblical scholars who aren't Christians. Like it was fascinating. You study this for a living and you don't believe it?
Mm-hmm.
But now I get it.
Yeah.
I get it, not only because it was so personal to me and foundational to who I am, but because it really is this story of the human struggle to figure out what the hell is going on.
Yeah. Context is always key with any kind of art, and in a way the Gospels can be considered they're not art per se, but the sort of artistic elements, the beauty, the truth, the poetry, the meaning that jumps out. A lot of that has got to do with contextualizing a piece of art. Like so much of it has got to do with that. That's something I clocked when the book Ways of Seeing by John Berger, or is it Berger? I don't know how to say it.
I haven't read it.
But he's got this TV show as well that he did. And one of the things he does is he shows this picture. He says, just look at this picture and see what you think about it, and then turn the page. And you turn over the page and it's the same picture, but it's got a caption now. It says, "This is the last painting Van Gogh made before he killed himself." It's like, how has that changed the way that you interact with this painting? And some people want to say it kind of shouldn't. No, the art should stand for itself, but it clearly does. Context plays a massive, massive part. And when you consider the first century Jewish context in which Jesus is working, so many of his claims are transformed. And this is something Christians always want to do when it comes to things like his claims to divinity and stuff. It's like, no, you have to understand, to a Jew at the time, this would have been a really significant thing to say. Claiming to be the Lord of the Sabbath would have been huge. Invoking the I am statement would have been absolutely massive. But I think we do need to do that sort of writ large. And maybe some of the good stuff needs to be contextualized as well as the bad stuff. Because they're willing to jump on it. Like if you say, what about what the Bible said? What about when Paul's talking about women or slavery in the Old Testament? It's like, oh, it's context. Like that doesn't apply today. It's like totally different. You got to understand there's the cult of Artemis and women were getting power that they shouldn't have, and they were bond servants. Okay, but with a lot of the rest of the stuff, it's just quite flatly like, the Bible gives us a guide as how to live today. It's eternal truth. Like, what do you mean? You need to reinterpret it. What are you talking about? And I just kind of think we should look for a bit more consistency on that front, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's that starting point, right? I think, you talk about and I know you've debated people on this, just the idea of just slavery in general in the Old Testament, right? And like just like the conquest, and it's so easy when you're like, well, my starting point is that this is true, and so any answer that helps me explain this. I mean, I remember my son, the first time he ever heard about Joshua's conquest, essentially coming home from church and being very upset. Like, God got people to destroy these other communities? And of course, I didn't have the answer that I've heard in most recent apologetics, that it was hyperbole, which I don't know if my son would have understood that. But I essentially was like, this is, God is God. God makes this decision, and he can use his people to carry it out. But also you need to know that these people that were killed were so sinful. And even the kids that were born into that, like the level of sinfulness was so high that it was ultimately an act of mercy. Like there's ways that you can talk about that. I think about that now. I'm like, what did I tell my very impressionable son? I basically said, there is a time in which genocide is justifiable.
Right.
That's essentially what I said.
And you're saying it to your son as well. It's like, well, you have to understand that, like, those little children, were just sort of so corrupt. Oh, and by the way, remember last week when we were talking about how all human beings are sort of necessarily corrupt and we all deserve hell? It's just for God's grace that what's that kid going to think? Wait, so hold on. So if you're sinful enough, then we should be genocided, okay? And then next week you're telling me that we're all born in sin, and I don't know. It's quite funny though if you had that. I mean, the idea of like hyperbole, oh, it's okay, son. They were just exaggerating.
They were exaggerating.
What, the teachers were exaggerating? It doesn't say that in the Bible? No, it does. God was exaggerating. That's what I mean. He just sort of, he just realized that we'd worked that out all these years later. That he was just
right.
blowing it up.
But then when you're okay, well, what was the context? What actually was happening? It's like, okay, well, this is probably some sort of retroactive history to kind of explain, how did we get here? Like, we were probably just some tribe that sort of broke off of the Canaanites or whatever, and and now we have to explain why we're not them, and like, let's create this story. And but I just think that if your starting point is this has to be true, this is God's word, and that is of utmost importance. We were talking about this last night too. The analogy that I use of the magic show. This is how I kind of explain my faith at this point, right? So if we're at a magic show and the magician is out there doing all this amazing stuff that to me, a non-magician, is just, I'm like, this is crazy. How does he do that? But I've got a professional magician next to me that after every trick, he explains what happened. He takes the magic out of it. Something about my personality loves both of those things. I love to be wowed and to believe that something is magic, and then I love to have this guy explain why it wasn't magic. And I think that at this point in my life, the explaining how this actually happened, how the Bible ended up the way that it was like, well, I believed that it was magic, and now I've got the guy sitting next to me like a Dan McLaughlin explaining why this is what it is. And I'm sort of equally into those two ideas. But to contextualize my like personal religious faith, I just can't help but hope that at least one of those tricks is magic, is real magic.
Yeah.
And that the tricks that this guy can't explain yet, like why we're here at all, whatever, some of these foundational things.
Consciousness, free will.
These things can't, no one's giving any great explanations for those things, and maybe they never will. And, I believe it was a member of the band AC/DC who talked about God is the blanket we throw over the mystery, I think was his line. And so I just think that there's this magic and this mystery that I sort of want to, that's my faith. That there's some magic and mystery in the universe that I don't want to explain away, and that I'm willing to throw the blanket over that and call that God. But I understand that that's not there's no dogma in that we can organize a movement around.
Yeah.
We don't go to some house of worship and say, okay, today we are going to worship the blanket over the mystery.
Yeah.
And so that's something I'm trying to figure out. Like, what is it?
And it's compatible with evolution.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, is that universal, Unitarianism or is that, is there some tradition that I can find a home in that like acknowledges the mystery? And so far, yeah, I'm kind of like, I don't think so. I'm not super motivated to figure that out, but
Yeah, very, very LA sort of. I don't know, man. Let's not put a label on it, man.
and this is I think it's, Britt Hartley, who I'm a fan of, who wrote No Nonsense Spirituality.
Mhm.
She's quick to point out that this is certainly a position of privilege, right? I am a successful entertainer who lives in Los Angeles
Mhm.
and has all my basic needs taken care of, and I can approach these things with just a passive intellectual curiosity.
Right.
I'm not fighting for my life. I'm not at risk because of the things that I believe. These statements may cause people to not like me, but I'm not, I'm not being persecuted in any way.
Yeah.
And also, I'm not living the kind of life where I need desperately to have hope that there is some sort of ultimate resurrection, that there is some sort, everything will be made right in the end because my life is so bad. My life is great, comparatively. And so, I recognize that just dabbling in this, I'm like, well, what if I would go to this church, or I could go to this church, or I could join this community?
Yeah.
There's an incredible privilege that comes with that. But it's my circumstance. It's like I'm doing the best I can.
Yeah.
Given the circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, and I appreciate you taking the time to spell out some of your beliefs. I mean, like I say, it's perhaps that uncomfortable thing 5 years ago, whenever it was that you decide you want to do this, because it's not the most user-friendly topic in the world for a lot of people. But at the same time, you want to be open with people, and it feels a bit weird if you're going to let people into any degree. This is such a big, important part of your life. You kind of have to let it be known, and hopefully in those 5 years, you felt like that was worth doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think the real struggle at this point, I have no regrets about having told the story and being honest about it. I think that the struggle is, what's the net good of me talking about these things?
Yeah, right.
Because I think that, and this is something I've been thinking about more recently, because there are some people, I think, that I don't want to disrupt. If their faith is working for them, I'm not interested in disrupting that just because I might believe that it's not true and that there's some sort of delusion. Because I think there's a certain personality that can kind of go through this process and actually come out on the other side and still feel like they're living a really meaningful life. And for me, I don't regret the deconstruction one bit. And I don't regret the, being public about it one bit. But I do ask, myself sometimes, I'm like, and I think this is what keeps me from talking about it more. It's just, okay, well, if I'm just taking something apart, but I'm not giving any tools, like what is my role in this? And also, it's just entering into the fray, which actually is a question I had for you, right? Because you are in the fray in talking about this stuff on a regular basis. Sure. And like 95% of the time, what I do is like the silliest, most unserious content on the internet, right?
Right.
And that you couldn't offend somebody with it if you tried.
Yeah.
But when I choose to, in the small minority of time that I choose to talk about this, I make enemies. People are like, "What are you doing? This is a bad example. You're bringing people away from the faith." And even though I'm like, well, actually, I think I'm just causing people to question things that should be questioned. It's still like I don't like getting that kind of negative attention.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't want to debate. I don't want to get into it with somebody online, really. Yeah. Right? I'm like, I'd rather just make you laugh, be a distraction from all the stuff that's going on in the world. But you obviously step right into it.
Yeah, it's my breakfast.
So like, how do you, how do you approach that, knowing that this is like, I know you were just talking about you being at this conference where you're basically the only atheist at this conference.
Yeah, that's right. It's great fun, actually. And I've got quite a good working relationship with the people I debate with and the communities that I sort of step into as a bit of an outsider. And so it feels all right. Like I don't have any serious trouble in that regard, but also it's always been the way it's been for me.
Yeah.
It's not like I've got this show and I'm about to like potentially nuke it with all of this talk about like religion and stuff. It's like that's what it's been from the start. Like, in fact, when I sort of move in the opposite direction, like, you know, when I've spoken to you today, you've been sort of telling your story. I've been asking questions. It's been interesting. I've done the same thing with Christians, where it's been a similar vibe of like, you're just telling me a story, and I'm not going to sit there and go, well, I think you're wrong about this, and you're going to start debating. And people in the comments kind of get annoyed about that sometimes. Or maybe annoyed's the wrong word, but they sort of say like, oh, you know, I wish you'd have pushed back more. And I'm like, this person's just like telling me their story, you know? I'm not here to do that today. And so if anything, I kind of have the opposite problem, which is that I need to be like opinionated, fiery. If I'm on the fence too much, then people start to lose interest in what they've signed up for, which is somebody to look to for a viewpoint, for an opinion. It'd be interesting to hear what that guy's got to say. And it's all context dependent. And honestly, I say that, but then as I've been a bit more willing to have those exploratory conversations and non-committal discussions, the channel has grown exponentially. And so I think that is resonating with people more. But I still, it means that when I do decide to come out and do the debate and remind people that actually I am still somebody who enjoys debating and defending an opinion and all of this kind of stuff, it's not like jarring for anybody, you know? And so, yeah, I mean, I get a lot of that kind of commentary, but it depends how you feel about it, right? Because if you, after this conversation goes live, if somebody says, that thing that he said about the empty tomb, that's just like wrong, man. Look at this verse or look at this thing. You're going to look at that and you might go like, that's kind of annoying. Oh man, like maybe I shouldn't have said that. Or whereas I'm going to be like, if it's significant enough, it's like, I'll just make a video about it. I'll just respond. I'll be like, okay, here's 5 arguments against the empty tomb, you know, because that's like my thing. So there's a sense to which also when those comments or when that attitude is coming towards me, I think, well, if it really comes to it, I'll just respond. Whereas you're not going to want to sit there making a video.
Do I want to go back? Do I want to get into a back and forth?
Exactly.
Because that's a, you know, I don't speak super precisely about these things, and I know a fair amount, but I'm not an expert on any of this stuff, and I'm not necessarily in the deep end. I'm usually just sort of like talking to people who are in the deep end.
Yeah, sure, right.
And so you know, like I know I've said things today that'll be like, oh, I put that way, and this guy is talking about it in this way, and I kind of regret that I said that, even though I've gotten much better about just not watching that stuff or caring too much. Just I know that's, you know, that's the business that those guys are in.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting because you started with this in mind versus this being for a lot of people, for me, it was a big like, what? We thought you guys were Christians. We feel betrayed because we would actually let our youth group watch your videos.
Yeah.
Because we kind of knew that you were Christians, right? And it's like, well, yeah, we were. We're not anymore. So it felt like the ultimate betrayal for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, I do sometimes get like, you know, teachers often say that they use my videos in class, for example, and a lot of school children watch. And I do then think, you know, man, I do need to be careful because debating is a sport. We talked about this last night as well.
Yeah.
And I've always been quite open about the fact that I think that debates are a bit sort of silly if you think that they're a way to get to the truth. I mean, they bring up interesting arguments and stuff, but everybody knows that they're not the most productive way to have a conversation.
Right.
It's a jousting match. But there's nothing wrong with that. Like, it's fun. It is sport. But as I often say to people, it's like a boxing match. You will find out who's the better boxer, but you won't find out who's the better fighter.
Yeah. And
there's nothing wrong with wanting to be a good boxer. You know, debating is fun, and so I'll do that. Yep. But people do watch it thinking that this is like, I don't know, that might be the only conversation they ever see on that topic. At least some of those viewers.
Yeah.
And it is a bit of a consideration. I remember, I look back at some of my older videos, and a lot of them I just had no idea what I was talking about. In particular, there's this old video of me talking about the ontological argument from when I was like, I don't know, 17 or something. And I watch it back today, and I'm just cringing with embarrassment. I won't take it down because like I like seeing the progression.
Right.
I
It's
like
a part of the
responding to it
historical
and stuff
record
like-
at this
But I
point.
remember like, my friends were making fun of me for it, and I'm looking at the comments on this video, and somebody says, Alex, thanks so much. I'm studying for my like A-level exams at the moment, and this video's been really helpful. And I thought, this poor kid has just failed his exams because he's been watching my videos.
Yeah.
And so there is a level of responsibility that comes along with it too. But that's why I'm also sort of trying to embody this spirit of conversational approach. Even like in a debate, I'll debate people, but then we're cool afterwards,
Yeah.
We'll hang out, we'll shake
And I
hands,
really
go for a drink.
appreciate that about your approach too, because I don't think there's ever really a reason to yell about this stuff.
No.
Debates
can bring that out of you, and it's a shame when that happens. But it also it's better just because it protects yourself as well. Even if you're just self-interested, like forget the sort of I want to foster positive community and all that kind of stuff. Even if you're just fully self-interested, if you walk in with this bravado and confidence, and somebody like proves you wrong, it's embarrassing. You're on stage and you're flustered and people are clipping it up and it's terrible. Whereas if you've gone in from the outset, like I'm doing this debate, I'm here, but I'm here to explore this.
Yeah.
I'm here to have a conversation. Then when somebody says, what about this? And you go, good point. It's not the end of the world because your pride isn't on the line in the same way. I always thought that if I did convert to Christianity, the way that I would announce it would be I would accept a debate about Christianity and I would let the opening speaker give their 20-minute opening statement, and then they'd call on me and I'd stand up and I'd go, you know what? Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, good point. All right, yeah, you win. Well done. And that would be how I would do it.
Yeah, you can make a moment out of that. Like many people are praying for that conversion.
Yeah, and when I finally become a Mormon, it's gonna really,
yeah, rug pull, man.
really shake them up. Yeah. Hey, Rhett, thanks so much for taking the time, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.